A beautiful couple thrives in Atlanta's hip-hop scene.
He was a performing rap artist.
He was gaining some traction in the streets of Atlanta. She was very attracted to that exciting lifestyle.
She fell in love with him.
But when one of these lovebirds is found clinging to life, evil secrets are revealed.
She was trying to tell her something, but she couldn't really make out what she was trying to say to her.
Investigators can immediately tell this was no random intruder.
She does notice that the door is unlocked, and this gives her a sinking feeling in her stomach.
Whoever committed the crime was led in voluntarily.
But tracking down the killer will be easier said than done.
What do you mean he's gone?
How did he just do this and leave? He had been on the run for 3.5 years.
The Mexican authorities got involved.
Everything was just a roller coaster.
May 27, 2014. It's just before morning twilight in the Atlanta bedroom community of Venetian Hills.
Venetian Hills is an urban environment, predominantly hard-working, middle-class community. It serves as a very good place for persons who work within the city.
But just after 3 a.m., as many residents are getting their last moments of sleep, the quiet night is interrupted by a harrowing 911 call.
I need ambulance, please. My sister is sad. Okay, is she awake? No.
She frantically begs them to get there quick because her sister is dying.
She's saying unconscious.
The caller, LaToya Jackson, provides the address of her mother's apartment where she and her sister Rashawn had been staying the night.
Atlanta police officers and emergency medical technicians rush to the mother's apartment.
When they arrive, first responders find Rashawn unresponsive on the floor, surrounded by her devastated mother and sister.
We can do everything we can do.
Responding officers start immediately providing rescue techniques. And it's critical because every second counts when it comes to trying to save someone's life.
As Rashawn's life hangs in the balance, her family is left wondering what evil has infiltrated their home and why was Rashawn the target. Born and raised in Atlanta, 34-year-old Rashawn Jackson was always known for her kind and generous spirit.
People really loved her and gravitated toward her. She was a very devoted daughter, a very loving aunt. She liked going shopping, buying gifts for her nieces and nephews. She loved every last person that she's around. She's just that type of person.
Rashawn also understood the value of hard work.
She was a manager at a popular Atlanta restaurant.
She was a good employee. You know, she would work all the time, very dependable, very trustworthy.
The first time I met Rashawn, I had just started working at the Chick-fil-A Dorf House, and she was a leader there. She's very outspoken. She loved to teach, so I can go to her about anything. She's very easy to talk to. She's funny at times, and I just love being around her.
Even with all her success, Rashawn dreamed of having someone to share it with.
Rashawn was also very optimistic about love. She wanted to find someone that she could share life with.
And when Rashawn met a man named Maurice Nesbitt in 2009, it seemed as though she'd finally found her match.
Excuse me, how you doing? I know you're not leaving already.
They initially met at a club. He approached her.
Yeah, I actually got to get up early in the morning for work.
What's your name?
It's Rashawn.
Rashawn, I'm Maurice. It's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, too.
Rashawn was intrigued by Maurice's bold personality and charming demeanor.
On his mother's side, he was Hispanic.
His mom still resided in Mexico, and Maurice was actually bilingual.
He was good looking, he was charismatic, and she was drawn to all of those things about him.
Can I trouble you for one more dance before you do?
Okay, just one?
Just one.
Instead of catching her ride home, Rashawn decided to head back upstairs with Maurice and never looked back.
They ended up dancing the night away. After that, Rashawn was smitten.
They got to know each other, they started dating.
She was drawn to his character, his personality, the way he made her feel.
But Maurice wasn't just charming. He was also talented.
Maurice was an up-and-coming rapper. He had some popularity in the city of Atlanta.
He went by the name of Mega Ruckus.
He had some videos that he had put out, and he was gaining some traction.
He even had a video with Young Thug, who was rising in his popularity in Atlanta at the time. He was moving in those circles.
The Atlanta rap scene is kind of the mecca for rappers trying to make it in the South. Maurice made lots of music videos showing off cars, money, jewelry.
It really appeared as though Maurice's music career was going to take off, and Rashawn was very attracted to that exciting lifestyle.
As far as Rashawn was concerned, Maurice was someone with a bright future ahead of him.
She was crazy about him.
The couple were head over heels in love, and they were making plans to move in together.
But now, instead of moving in with the man she loved, Rashawn has been shot inside her mother's apartment and left clinging to life.
It was quickly determined that the victim had been shot in the head, point blank.
Initially, you can see with the contact wound to the head that it was not likely that she would survive.
Pulse is gone.
Unfortunately, with all their efforts to save her life, it was too late. Rashawn Jackson is dead.
34-year-old restaurant manager Rashawn Jackson had fallen head over heels for up-and-coming Atlanta rapper Maurice Nesbitt, a.k.a. Mega Ruckus.
She saw him as someone that she could really spend her life with and have a serious relationship with.
She loved his creativity and his passion for his music. It seemed like his career was getting ready to take off.
But now, Rashawn is lying in a pool of blood with a fatal gunshot wound.
Paramedics attempted to provide first aid, but the victim had been shot in the head, point blank.
Pulse is gone.
Unfortunately, with all their efforts to save her life, it was too late. Rashawn Jackson is dead.
Officers give the devastating news to Rashawn's mother and sister.
Rashawn's mother was beside herself.
The family was just too distraught to even communicate with police officers at that time.
In an effort to get a more cohesive and coherent statement and give them time to calm down, they did have to take them down to the police precinct.
As Rashawn's family continues to process the tragedy, detectives arrive to begin processing the crime scene.
Her body was in between the bed and the closet.
It seems Rashawn was caught off guard by her killer. There's a pool of blood under Rashawn's head, as well as blood splatter leading into the direction of the closet.
Around the room, detectives locate more potential clues.
We see some cigarettes in the room. We see a couple of beer cans.
These items were collected and sent off to the crime lab in hopes they would find DNA evidence.
Investigators also find ballistic evidence that they can try to tie back to the murder weapon.
The investigators find a 9mm shell casing, which is collected and sent off to ballistic analysis.
Outside of Rashawn's bedroom, the rest of the apartment appears to be undisturbed.
When investigators checked the entirety of the house, they found that there's no evidence of forced entry. The house had not been ransacked. There appeared that no items were missing.
It seems more like whoever killed Rashawn was either let into the apartment or had a key of their own.
This must have been someone Rashawn knew.
Hoping to get an idea of who that person might be, officers begin a canvass of the apartment complex.
Officers began door-to-door canvassing of the neighborhood.
But while several neighbors heard the gunshot, none of them saw the person who fired the gun.
Without a visual description, homicide detectives had very little to go on.
Until they meet with the apartment complex's leasing manager.
Detectives discovered that there are cameras located on the property that could provide some surveillance video.
All right. Here's the parking lot just before 3 a.m.
He shows detectives the footage, and they can see a white car pulling up around 2:41 a.m.
The vehicle parks just a few yards away from the Jacksons' front door, and a shadowy figure exits.
You see him get out of his car, you can see him walk in the apartment.
For the next few minutes, there's no other activity on the video.
He stayed in there for probably 30 minutes to 45 minutes.
At that point, he can be seen exiting the apartment, entering his vehicle, and speeding away.
As they continue to watch the video, minutes later they could see emergency vehicles arriving on the scene to attend to Rashawn.
Radio, we have a confirmation on suspect vehicles.
Detectives believe this is no coincidence.
Detectives are certain that this man has to be Rashawn's killer.
Police in Atlanta, Georgia are investigating the homicide of Rashawn Jackson after the 34-year-old restaurant manager was shot dead in the middle of the night.
In this once quiet neighborhood of Venetian Hills, the people are just fearful. If something like this could happen to Rashawn, what about the rest of them?
But detectives have a hunch this was a targeted attack. And now they've discovered surveillance video of Rashawn's suspected killer leaving the crime scene.
It definitely looked like he was in a hurry to get out of there.
While the video is compelling evidence, it's not a slam dunk for investigators.
It does not provide a clear view of the suspect's face, nor the tag number on the vehicle. The video surveillance is just too grainy to make out clear details.
Still, they radioed to police in the area with a description of the car.
The detective issues an all-points bulletin to be on the lookout for that vehicle. The white sedan.
News of Rashawn's death soon spreads throughout the greater Atlanta area.
When I first heard of Rashawn's passing, I was on my way to work at that moment where we worked together. Once I found out I couldn't work the rest of the day, a few of us couldn't work the rest of the day. So it was the hardest news.
Meanwhile, detectives head back to the station to speak with Rashawn's grieving mother and sister.
They start trying to figure out what happened. What did they hear? What did they see? Who could have done this to Rashawn?
Rashawn's loved ones are still overwhelmed by everything that's happened.
They are absolutely distraught, but they want to see justice served.
Detectives start the interview by asking the family members to slowly walk them through everything that happened that night.
I'm so sorry for your loss. We're gonna get to the bottom of this.
Can you please tell us everything you remember about what happened?
Yes, well, it was a normal evening.
Rashawn's family tells detectives that yesterday was just like another day. Nothing stuck out of the ordinary about Rashawn's activity or her behavior.
They were at her mother's home, and Rashawn had came home from work, and they were all just hanging out for a little while.
They all went to bed around 11 p.m.
LaToya says she distinctly remembers locking the front door before turning in for the night.
She told the police that she locked the door, and she went upstairs and she laid in the bed with her mom and fell asleep.
I'm a heavy sleeper, so I didn't hear the gunshot go off, but it woke Mama up.
That's right.
Around 3 a.m., Miss Jackson was awakened by a loud pop.
I tried to find the source of the noise.
It startles her, so she gets up out of her bed and moves towards the sound.
Miss Jackson says she walked into the living room and didn't see anything unusual. However, she did hear a car start outside.
She hears the sound of tires screeching.
At this point, she looks out the window and doesn't see the car. But she does notice the door is unlocked, and this gives her a sinking feeling in her stomach.
Rashawn? Rashawn!
Concerned, Rashawn's mother went to check on her.
She called out to Rashawn, and there was no answer.
When she opened the bedroom door, she saw Rashawn lying on the floor near her closet.
She was unsure of what exactly was going on, but as she approached her daughter, she saw the blood.
Rashawn! Oh, my baby! Latoya!
Rashawn's sister runs in the room. She goes to assist her sister, and her sister is barely breathing.
What happened? I don't know!
Miss Jackson tells detectives that for a moment, Rashawn was still conscious and trying to say something.
Oh, come on, baby. Come on, baby. We're here.
She tries to, talk to her, say like, don't die, stay awake, and she says Rashawn is trying to speak to her.
She's trying to say something to her, but she can't get the words out. So at this point, Rashawn's sister grabs the phone to dial 911.
I need ambulance, please. My sister is sad.
Rashawn's mother says she held her daughter in her arms until first responders arrived.
She said she was trying to feel for her heartbeat, but by the time paramedics arrived, it was too late.
Her daughter basically died in her arms.
Did you hear anyone else inside of the home? Was Rashawn fighting with anyone?
Not at all.
There is no statements from her mother or sister that they heard any type of arguing or anything like that. All we knew was there was a gunshot.
It's a horrifying story, and investigators offer their condolences for the family's loss.
But they also have an important question they're hoping the family will be able to answer.
They were asking them who could have done this to her.
The two women immediately give the same answer.
There's only one person that they could think of.
They told him, basically, that the only person that could have done it was Maurice Nesbitt.
Police in Atlanta have just heard a harrowing account from Rashawn Jackson's mother about her daughter dying in her arms after suffering a fatal gunshot wound from an apparent intruder.
There was nothing more that she could do, and the pain and the devastation that she felt in that moment as the life left her daughter's body, she would never be the same again.
Based on evidence at the Jackson home, it seems that Rashawn Jackson opened the door for her killer, and her loved ones have a strong suspect.
They told him, basically, that the only person that could have done it was Maurice Nesbitt.
When Rashawn met Maurice in 2009, she was instantly infatuated with him. He possessed this larger-than-life rapper persona, and she was mesmerized by that.
He sold her a pipe dream that she could have it all with him, and she wanted to believe it.
It didn't take long, though, before Rashawn's family started to notice a change in her.
She changed when she was with him. She wasn't the same anymore.
Her mood turned dark, and she began not to be the bubbly person that they knew.
And I think that's when her family started to become suspicious of what was happening.
I never liked him.
Rashawn's mother definitely did not approve of Maurice. When Maurice came around, it was kind of a different energy that did not need to be in her house at that time.
Rashawn's mother says when she first heard Maurice rapping under his mega ruckus persona, she was shocked by how crude his lyrics were.
His songs were about violence, guns, and his lyrics were very demeaning towards women.
I expressed my concerns to Rashawn, but she just brushed it off.
When he talked to Rashawn about it, she said he only rapped about those things, and that's not who he was in real life.
But before long, the family noticed other telltale signs that something was horribly wrong.
They began to notice marks on Rashawn's body. And when they asked her about it, she would make excuses as though she fell or bumped into something.
And it was unlike her to lie to us, but we could tell that she was covering up for him.
They believed that Maurice had begun abusing her.
And according to the family, the abuse wasn't only physical.
He was taking her hard-earned money from her.
I'm gonna need another 1K for this video.
Maurice did not have a steady income. He would definitely come to Rashawn for money if he needed it, whether it be for music or whatever he asked for. Rashawn was being used.
Baby, are you sure? I mean, we've already spent a lot.
I know, baby, but I promise when this video pop off, it's gonna make a difference for the both of us.
He made promises to Rashawn. You know, he promised her that they would move in together, that they would be a family, and she took those to heart. And she would actually give him some of her checks in an effort to show him how much she loved him.
Thank you, baby. This new video gonna be fire.
Well, you know I'm your biggest fan.
I only heard maybe 1 or 2 songs. They were not hit makers to me.
I think he was making his life or trying to appear more grandiose than it actually was. No one was really buying what he was selling, so his career didn't take off.
We tried to convince Rashawn that she deserved better and that she needed to dump him.
They started to tell her, like, hey, maybe he's not this great guy that you think he is, and you should probably separate from him.
Eventually, she started to listen to us.
After time, Rashawn began to understand that the abuse was occurring, and she decided that she would not continue it.
Finally, in May 2014, after almost 6 years of dating, Rashawn worked up the courage to break up with Maurice.
She told Maurice that she was tired of being used and abused by him.
But she was still afraid of him. That's why she moved in with me.
To escape his reach and access, she moved back in with her mother.
He was still trying to harass her on the phone.
She didn't have no contact at all, but it was ways Maurice found her. That was what she would say, he would find me.
They had been apart for probably about 2 weeks, 3 weeks, when, you know, he didn't stop calling, didn't stop trying to text her, but she was separating herself from him, just going to work and just trying to get things back to normal.
I think that's why he came to the house last night, to confront her in person.
Based on what they're hearing, detectives agree that Maurice is a probable suspect. They just have one more question for Rashawn's loved ones.
Do you know what kind of car Maurice drives?
Yes, a white sedan.
The suspect from their surveillance footage was also driving a white sedan.
That's him. That's definitely him.
Armed with the family statement, detectives begin their work to bring Maurice to justice.
They have information that Maurice Nesbitt drives his white car, but that isn't sufficient, you know, for them to get an arrest warrant because nobody saw him shoot her. They needed more evidence, so they started doing a background search of Maurice Nesbitt.
When they run the background check, investigators discover that Maurice has a long criminal history.
They discovered that Maurice Nesbitt was a convicted felon. He did have a prior history for drugs, for guns, and also for domestic violence.
Some of the police reports were filed by Rashawn herself.
In one incident report from 2009, Rashawn reports that Maurice punched her in the face and kicked her in the mouth.
Maurice threatened to kill not only her, but her whole family if she didn't do what he wanted her to do.
Rashawn told police that Maurice was terrorizing her. It's clear to the detectives that this was an abusive relationship that was spiraling out of control.
And when investigators pull Maurice's DMV records, they confirm what Rashawn's loved ones told them. Maurice owns a white sedan, like the one seen in the surveillance video.
The car description from the DMV records matched the car that was on the crime scene the night of Rashawn's murder.
But the DMV records aren't the only proof the car belongs to Maurice.
They ended up finding one of his rap videos on YouTube. In the video, while he's rapping and stuff, he has this white car in the background.
For the police, this is a clear sign that they're onto the right track.
Detectives needed to speak with Maurice Nesbitt immediately.
Atlanta homicide investigators believe Maurice Nesbitt is responsible for the shooting death of his ex-girlfriend, 34-year-old Rashawn Jackson.
His car was spotted on surveillance at the apartment complex when Rashawn was killed, and he had been abusive to her in the past.
The detective's next move is try to have a sit-down interview and question Maurice, but when they reach out to him, he does not answer the phone.
So at this point, they issue a bolo for Maurice and a warrant for his arrest.
While patrol officers are on the hunt, investigators continue to build their case.
The DA's office gets involved at that point, and we start issuing subpoenas for phone records to see if, in addition to the car being in a surveillance video, we could link him there with his cell phone.
As they look through the log of calls and texts, what they see lines up with what they heard from Rashawn's family. Maurice refused to accept her rejection.
In the couple's messages, Rashawn is clearly pushing Maurice away, but he refuses to take no as an answer.
Whenever she tries to turn him away, he resorts to threats and insults.
There were several text messages where he would text her back to back to back. Why don't you answer your phone? Why don't you answer your phone? Where are you?
Less than 2 weeks before the murder, Maurice even sent an overt threat.
Maurice sends a message that every dog has its day, and yours is coming up.
To investigators, this was a clear indication that he was plotting some type of revenge for Rashawn cutting him out of her life.
With every piece of evidence they came across, the police were convinced more and more that Maurice was responsible for this crime.
Their suspicions were heightened when they realized that Maurice was clearly laying low to avoid law enforcement.
Weeks go by without any sign of the wanted man.
There was no doubt in my mind. I knew it was Maurice. At that time, we was wondering, where is Maurice? How did he just do this and leave?
He was doing everything in his power to avoid coming in contact with law enforcement.
Then on July 23rd, 2014, investigators finally receive a solid lead on their fugitive.
Homicide.
Nearly 2 months after Rashawn was killed, police received a tip that Maurice was seen in Jonesboro, Georgia. Jonesboro is a very small community just south of Atlanta.
Police swiftly respond to the address provided by the tipster and take Maurice into custody. In an interrogation room, they hope he'll come clean, but those hopes are instantly dashed.
When the interrogation starts, Maurice immediately asks for a lawyer.
Give me my lawyer, man. He declines to answer any questions.
But despite Maurice's unwillingness to give a statement, he has no choice but to give police a sample of his DNA.
They already had a warrant for the DNA, so he couldn't get out of that one. If his DNA is found on the items collected from Rashawn's bedroom, they can place him at the scene of the crime.
Even without a confession, the investigators feel confident in the evidence they've gathered. They charge Maurice with felony murder and book him in the Fulton County Jail.
When Rashawn's family gets the information that Maurice had been arrested, they are relieved that he is finally behind bars.
Knowing that Maurice was finally arrested and actually facing a jury, that brought a big relief.
But that relief is short-lived.
Prosecutors really wanted to have those DNA results before the trial, but it was taking a while.
In Georgia, you have 90 days to indict someone after they've been in custody, or either they're entitled to bond at that point. So once the 90 days came, I believe his attorney filed a motion for a bond reduction hearing, and they presented some information that his health may be at risk, that he had cancer.
I've never heard of Rashawn saying that he had cancer or being sick at all.
The judge, I'm not sure if they actually verified it or not, but he was granted a bond to deal with the issues surrounding his cancer.
His bond is set at $150,000, and he's actually able to make the bond. He was allowed to be released on an ankle monitor.
For Rashawn's family, this was infuriating and insulting, that the potential killer could just walk out of the courtroom, a free man, essentially.
When I first learned Maurice was out on bond, I felt like there was almost no justice there.
But when the DNA results from the crime scene come back, prosecutors finally feel ready to try the case.
When the test results come back, they're a positive match for the saliva found on the cigarette butts and the beer cans.
It places him in a room, which is really, really strong evidence.
Maurice Nesbitt's murder trial begins on September 25th, 2017. In their opening statement, prosecutors argue that the couple's relationship reached a tipping point when Rashawn finally decided to leave.
She was getting fed up with it, and she had made up her mind and she wasn't going to go back. And I guess that's when he decided that if he couldn't have her, then no one else could have her.
Once he felt that his control was being lost and she was finally breaking free, he couldn't handle that.
In the early morning hours of May 27th, Maurice was begging Rashawn to let him see her.
Around 3 o'clock in the morning, Maurice shows up to the apartment.
Records show Maurice had been spamming Rashawn's phone with calls.
So Rashawn was probably expecting him.
Yeah, look, can I talk to you in person? I just need 5 minutes of your time, that's it.
He asked to just talk and hang out for a few minutes. Rashawn lets him in.
Victims let their abusers back into their lives for numerous reasons. Emotional attachment, hoping for change, or fear of retaliation. The cycle of abuse can make leaving these type of relationships permanently a difficult challenge.
Prosecutors argue Maurice convinced Rashawn to let him come up to her room.
And this feel like old times. I really been missing you.
Maurice, no. I told you it's not like that between me and you anymore.
Instead of parting amicably, Maurice decided that he was going to put his plan in action and end her life.
Okay, if that's what you want.
Because there was no struggle at the scene of the crime, prosecutors believe that Rashawn never saw what was coming. She was totally taken by surprise.
While the woman he claimed to love for 6 years lay on the floor bleeding out, Maurice flees the scene and goes into hiding.
The prosecutors laid an insurmountable amount of evidence.
Maurice could tell things were not going in his favor.
By the 5th day of trial, prosecutors are feeling confident they'll have a win.
I was pleased with the evidence that I had put up, and we were about to do closings and get that conviction for her.
But Maurice has other plans.
What do you mean he's gone?
And on this morning, Maurice was not there.
Maurice had gone on the run.
Atlanta prosecutors are 5 days into the trial of aspiring rapper Maurice Nesbitt for the murder of his girlfriend of 6 years, Rashawn Jackson.
But now on the last day of the trial, Maurice has failed to show up to court. And by all indications, he's gone on the run.
It's getting closer and closer to time when court is supposed to start, and there's still no Maurice Nesbitt.
What do you mean he's gone?
They quickly tracked down Maurice's ankle monitor, and they were able to determine it was cut off 6 hours earlier.
Based on the information from his ankle monitor, Maurice was last seen heading south from Atlanta on Interstate 75.
By now, investigators know he could be hundreds of miles away.
Atlanta police now issue a BOLO, and surrounding agencies are notified.
He's considered armed and dangerous.
Back at the courthouse, prosecutors present a plan to proceed with the trial in Maurice's absence.
The state argued that it would be unfair to Rashawn and her family to have to do this again.
The judge agrees, and Maurice's trial continues without him.
The judge decided that we would do the closing arguments with him not being present and let the jury deliberate without him being present, which was great for the state. We can argue now, he did it, that's why he's gone, that's why he ran.
The jury agrees.
They find Maurice guilty of felony murder, aggravated assault, and possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony.
He is sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional 5 years for the weapons charges.
But investigators still have to find him.
Maurice not being there for his sentencing was kind of crazy. It was very sad knowing that he wasn't there for his sentencing.
He moved underground, he was just moving around so that he couldn't be seen.
Weeks go by with no sign of the wanted fugitive and no leads on his whereabouts.
Since his mother's from Mexico, they think he could have fled the country.
The Mexican authorities got involved, and they did everything in their power to track him down. Unfortunately, there were never any solid leads.
Weeks turn into months, and months turn into years with no sign of Maurice.
3.5 long years go by without any new developments. But that changes on April 12, 2021, when the case receives renewed national attention.
The story is featured on In Pursuit with John Walsh in America's Most Wanted.
The tactic pays off.
Someone watching the show recognized him as their roommate and called the police to have him arrested.
The anonymous tipster says that Maurice is living under an assumed identity in Birmingham, Alabama.
They actually give the police the exact address where Maurice is hiding out.
On April 19th, police finally arrest Maurice Nesbitt again. And this time, they aren't letting him go.
Maurice is extradited back to Georgia, where he finally begins to serve the prison sentence the jury handed to him.
The same judge that tried the case sentenced him formally to the life plus 5 years, and he's been in custody ever since.
That brings great big relief. I'm pretty sure in the family's life, and mine, and everybody that was close to her, it brought big relief. It was definitely closure for a lot of people.
For any woman that is in a situation like Rashawn was in, there are resources to help you get out of that situation before he ends up harming you too bad or taking your life. And I mean, if the writings are on the wall, listen to your instincts and just go.
With Rashawn not being here, The world, I would say, has lost a very bright, outgoing.
On the morning of November 18th, still 1987, there was nothing to suggest that two young Canadians setting out from Vancouver Island would become the center of one of the Pacific Northwest's most enduring homicide investigations. 19-year-old Jay Cook and 18-year-old Tanya Van Cuylenborg left the Greater Victoria area expecting to complete a routine business errand in Washington state. Their journey required crossing the international border into the United States, delivering furnace parts connected to J.S. father's business, and returning home. For their families, it was an ordinary trip. There was no indication that either of them believed they were in danger. There were no reports that they feared being followed, no known threats directed toward them, and no evidence suggesting they anticipated anything unusual. Yet before the week was over, both would be dead, and investigators would begin pursuing answers that would remain beyond reach for more than 30 years. The disappearance unfolded quietly at first. Family members expected the couple to return after completing their trip, and when they did not, concern gradually replaced confidence. Delays happen. Vehicles break down. Travel plans change unexpectedly. But as the hours passed without communication, those ordinary explanations became increasingly difficult to accept. Relatives contacted authorities, providing every detail they could remember about the planned journey, the route, and the vehicle the couple had taken. What began as a missing person investigation quickly expanded across to countries. Canadian and American law enforcement agencies exchanged information, attempting to determine where the young couple had last been seen and whether anyone could account for their movements after they crossed the border. The investigation immediately presented unusual challenges. Unlike a disappearance confined to a single jurisdiction, this case crossed an international boundary. Detectives in British Columbia and Washington state had to coordinate information, compare timelines, and share investigative leads while working under different agencies and legal systems. Every confirmed fact mattered. Investigators established that Jay and Tanya had entered Washington state, but the precise sequence of their movements afterward remained uncertain. Without modern mobile phones, GPS records, or digital payment histories, reconstructing a person's journey depended heavily on witness interviews, receipts, public observations, and physical evidence. As news of the disappearance spread, photographs of the young couple appeared in newspapers and television broadcasts throughout the region. Volunteers, relatives, and investigators hoped someone might remember seeing them or recognize their vehicle. Telephone tips began arriving. Some callers believed they had seen a van matching the description. Others reported possible sightings of the couple. Detectives examined each lead, understanding that even a seemingly insignificant observation could establish an important point in the timeline. Most tips ultimately failed to produce definitive answers, but each required careful evaluation before being ruled out. The investigation changed dramatically on November 24th, still 1987. A person traveling through a rural area of Skagit County, Washington, discovered the body of Tanya Van Cuylenborg. Law enforcement officers secured the scene immediately, recognizing that it now represented a homicide investigation rather than a missing person search. Crime scene specialists documented the area methodically, photographing the location, recording the position of physical evidence, and collecting biological and trace evidence according to the forensic standards of the time. Even in 1987, experienced investigators understood that preserving evidence correctly could determine whether a case would one day be solved. Despite this tragic discovery, uncertainty remained. Jay Cook had still not been found. Detectives continued searching while simultaneously processing Tanya's homicide scene. 2 days later, on November 26th, another devastating discovery confirmed investigators' worst fears. Jay's body was located in Snohomish County, approximately 60 miles from where Tanya had been found. The existence of two separate recovery locations immediately indicated that the investigation would be far more complex than a single scene. Homicide. Investigators now faced multiple locations requiring independent forensic examination, including the sites where each victim had been discovered and, eventually, the recovery location of the couple's van in Bellingham. The distances between those locations raised difficult questions. Had the victims been separated shortly after encountering their attacker? Had they been transported against their will? Where had the initial encounter occurred? Investigators could not answer those questions immediately, but they recognized that the offender had likely moved through several locations, increasing both the complexity of the crime and the opportunities for physical evidence to exist. Every mile between the scenes represented another segment of a timeline that detectives would spend years attempting to reconstruct. The recovered van became another critical piece of the investigation. Crime scene technicians processed it carefully, searching for fingerprints, fibers, biological material, and other forms of physical evidence. They documented its condition in detail, knowing that the vehicle represented one of the few controlled environments directly connected to the victim's final journey. Items collected from the van would later remain among the most important pieces of preserved evidence in the entire investigation. As investigators worked, communities on both sides of the border struggled to understand what had happened. The murders appeared to involve two young people with no known connection to violent crime and no publicly identified reason to become targets. That uncertainty intensified public concern. If Jay and Tanya had simply encountered the wrong person during an ordinary trip, the crime suggested a frightening degree of randomness. Residents followed each development closely, hoping that investigators would identify a suspect before another tragedy occurred. The forensic capabilities available in the late 1980s were advancing but remained limited compared with modern standards. Detectives relied heavily on witness interviews, fingerprint analysis, ballistic examinations, and traditional investigative techniques. DNA profiling was still in its early stages and could not yet provide the kind of investigative breakthroughs that later generations would consider routine. Nevertheless, investigators carefully preserved biological evidence collected during the investigation. That decision, although unremarkable at the time, would eventually become one of the most consequential choices made during the entire case. As weeks became months, investigators pursued every credible lead they could identify. Witnesses were interviewed repeatedly. Known offenders were examined where appropriate. Evidence was submitted for laboratory testing as scientific methods evolved. Yet despite sustained effort, no suspect could be identified. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg gradually entered the growing list of unsolved homicide investigations, but detectives refused to classify the case as forgotten. Instead, they preserved every report, every photograph, every item of evidence, and every recorded interview, believing that future developments in forensic science might someday reveal answers unavailable in 1987. For the families, the passing years brought no relief from unanswered questions. Every anniversary served as a reminder that two young lives had ended suddenly during what should have been an ordinary journey. For investigators, the case remained unfinished. It represented a file that could not be closed because the most important question remained unresolved. Who had committed the murders? And could that person still be identified after the passage of decades? At the time, few could have imagined that the answer would ultimately emerge not from a confession or an eyewitness, but from scientific advances that had not yet been invented when the investigation first began. The discovery of the two crime scenes marked the beginning of one of the most extensive homicide investigations in the Pacific Northwest during the late 1980s. Detectives now faced the difficult task of reconstructing the final days of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg using only physical evidence, documented witness accounts, and the limited forensic technologies available at the time. Unlike modern investigations, there were no mobile phone records to trace, no GPS data showing vehicle movements, and no network of digital surveillance cameras documenting their route. Every fact had to be established through traditional investigative methods, requiring patience, coordination, and careful attention to detail. Investigators first focused on building an accurate timeline. Public records established that Jay Cook, 19, and Tanya Van Cuylenborg, 18, departed the Greater Victoria area of British Columbia on November 18, 1987. Their destination was Washington State, where they intended to deliver furnace parts associated with J.S. father's business before returning home. Family members described the trip as routine. Nothing suggested the couple expected danger or intended to alter their plans significantly. Detectives therefore treated every confirmed sighting after they crossed the international border as a critical piece of evidence. The investigation required close cooperation between Canadian and American authorities. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, local police agencies in British Columbia, the Washington State Patrol, county sheriff's offices, and multiple municipal police departments exchanged information throughout the early stages of the case. Coordinating across international boundaries presented practical challenges. Investigators had to compare interview notes, reconcile timelines, and ensure that evidence collected in different jurisdictions remained properly documented. Despite those challenges, law enforcement agencies maintained regular communication because determining where the victims had traveled in, where they had last been seen alive, was essential to narrowing the investigation. Crime scene investigators processed each location independently. Tanya Van Quillenborg's body was discovered in rural Skagit County on November 24th, SIL, 1987. Jay Cook's body was found 2 days later in Snohomish County. The distance between the two recovery sites immediately indicated that the offender had moved through multiple locations after encountering the victims. Detectives carefully documented environmental conditions, photographed each scene extensively, prepared detailed sketches, and collected biological and trace evidence. Their objective was to preserve every item that might later help reconstruct the sequence of events. The victim's van, recovered separately in Bellingham, became another central focus of the investigation. Forensic specialists examined both the interior and exterior of the vehicle using the techniques available at the time. Fingerprints were processed where possible. Fibers, hairs, biological material, and other trace evidence were collected and preserved. Investigators also documented the vehicle's condition and searched for anything capable of indicating where the victims had traveled after entering Washington State. Although forensic science in 1987 could not answer every question, experienced detectives understood that preserving physical evidence might allow future technologies to reveal information unavailable at the time. At the same time, investigators launched an extensive witness canvass. Detectives interviewed individuals who lived or worked near the locations where the bodies and the van had been discovered. Employees at gas stations, restaurants, motels, convenience stores, and other businesses were asked whether they had seen the young couple or their vehicle. Truck drivers, delivery workers, local residents, and anyone believed capable of contributing information received attention from investigators. Public appeals through newspapers and television encouraged additional witnesses to come forward. Hundreds of tips were received during the months following the murders. Every report required evaluation, even when it ultimately proved unrelated. Investigators also examined whether the case shared similarities with other violent crimes committed in the Pacific Northwest during that period. Detectives compared victim profiles, methods of operation, geographic patterns, and available forensic evidence with other open investigations. Such comparisons are standard practice in homicide investigations involving strangers because they may reveal previously unidentified links between cases. Publicly available records indicate that investigators explored multiple possibilities, but no comparison produced sufficient evidence to establish a confirmed connection with another offender or series of crimes. Throughout the investigation, detectives maintained detailed records of interviews, laboratory submissions, evidence inventories, and investigative decisions. These documents would later become invaluable. Cold case investigations often depend upon the quality of records created during the earliest stages of an inquiry. In this case, reports prepared in 1987 allowed future investigators to understand precisely what evidence had been collected, where it had been recovered, how it had been preserved, and which investigative leads had already been examined. As months passed without identifying a suspect, frustration grew among investigators and within the affected communities. The murders had generated widespread public attention because they appeared to involve two ordinary young people undertaking an ordinary trip across the border. Families in both Canada and the United States followed media coverage closely, hoping each new development would finally identify the person responsible. Instead, investigators encountered the limitations of contemporary forensic science. While biological evidence had been collected successfully, DNA profiling remained in its infancy. The available technology could not yet identify an unknown offender whose DNA was absent from existing law enforcement records. Rather than abandoning the investigation, detectives adopted a long-term approach. Physical evidence remained in secure storage. Biological samples were preserved according to forensic standards. Witness statements were retained for future review. Whenever scientific methods improved, investigators revisited the evidence to determine whether additional testing might produce new information. This commitment to preserving evidence reflected an important investigative principle. Even when current technology cannot solve a crime, future scientific advances may provide opportunities that do not yet exist. The investigation gradually entered cold case status, but that designation did not mean the case had been closed. Instead, it indicated that all immediately available investigative leads had been pursued without identifying the offender. Detectives continued to review the file periodically, recognizing that significant advances in forensic science or the emergence of new evidence could justify reopening active investigative efforts. As later events would demonstrate, that decision to preserve evidence, maintain detailed records, and revisit the case as technology evolved became one of the defining reasons the investigation was ultimately solved decades after the murders occurred. As the initial search for witnesses and physical evidence produced fewer new leads, the investigation entered a more methodical phase. Detectives shifted their focus from immediate response to long-term case development, reviewing every confirmed movement of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Queilenborg and comparing each verified fact against the physical evidence recovered from multiple locations. The objective was no longer simply to determine what had happened, but to establish how the crimes had unfolded, where the victims had encountered the offender, and whether any overlooked detail could identify the person responsible. Investigators understood that stranger homicides often depend upon the careful reconstruction of seemingly ordinary events, and in this case, even the smallest verified fact could prove significant. One of the first priorities was establishing the victim's timeline as accurately as possible. Investigators confirmed that Jay and Tanya had crossed from British Columbia into Washington state on November 18, 1987. Publicly available records indicate that they intended to deliver furnace parts connected with J.S. father's business before returning home. Beyond that general itinerary, however, many details remained uncertain. Unlike contemporary investigations, detectives could not rely on cell phone location data, electronic toll records, digital purchases, or extensive surveillance camera footage. Instead, they examined receipts, interviewed potential witnesses, reviewed available business records, and attempted to identify anyone who might have seen the couple during their journey. The victim's van remained one of the most important sources of physical evidence. Crime scene specialists conducted detailed examinations using the forensic methods available in the late 1980s. Latent fingerprint processing, trace evidence collection, fiber examination, and biological evidence recovery formed the core of laboratory work. Every item recovered from the vehicle was carefully documented before being submitted for analysis, although many forensic techniques familiar today were either unavailable or still developing. Investigators recognized that preserving evidence properly would allow future scientific testing if technology advanced. The geographical distribution of the evidence presented another challenge. Tanya Van Queilenborg's body was found in Skagit County, Jay Cook's body was recovered in Snohomish County, and the van was located separately in Bellingham. The detectives mapped each location carefully, comparing travel routes, estimated driving times, and possible locations where the victims may have encountered the offender. They examined whether the crimes reflected a planned sequence of events or whether opportunities had arisen unexpectedly during the journey. While investigators developed multiple working theories, publicly available records indicate that none could be conclusively established during the early years of the investigation. Witness interviews continued for months. Detectives spoke with residents living near the recovery locations, employees at businesses along likely travel routes, truck drivers, delivery personnel, and anyone who might have encountered the victims or their vehicle. Media appeals generated numerous public tips, each requiring careful evaluation. Some reports appeared promising initially, but could not be corroborated through additional investigation. Others conflicted with established timelines or lacked sufficient detail to advance the inquiry. As is common in major homicide investigations, the overwhelming majority of leads ultimately proved unrelated, but investigators documented each one before reaching that conclusion. At the same time, detectives examined individuals who might reasonably require further investigation based on available evidence. Publicly available information indicates that law enforcement reviewed known violent offenders, compared aspects of the case with other investigations, and considered whether similar crimes occurring in the region shared identifiable characteristics. Such comparisons are a standard investigative practice intended to determine whether multiple offenses may have been committed by the same individual. Despite extensive review, investigators were unable to establish a confirmed connection that identified the offender responsible for the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Queilenborg. Forensic laboratories continued examining biological evidence collected during the investigation. During the late 1980s, DNA technology remained in its early stages and was not capable of providing the investigative power that later generations would take for granted. Nevertheless, scientists preserved biological samples carefully, recognizing their potential future value. This decision reflected an important principle of homicide investigation. Evidence that cannot answer today's questions may answer tomorrow's, if scientific methods improve. The original investigators could not predict how rapidly forensic genetics would develop over the following decades, but their commitment to preserving evidence ensured that future investigators would retain every opportunity to benefit from those advances. As months turned into years, the investigation increasingly became what law enforcement agencies classify as a cold case. That designation did not mean detectives believed the crimes were unsolvable. Rather, it indicated that all available investigative leads had been pursued without identifying a suspect. The case remained active within law enforcement records. Evidence continued to be preserved securely, and investigators periodically revisited the file whenever improvements in forensic science or new information justified additional review. Reports created during the original investigation proved especially valuable because they documented precisely where evidence had been recovered, who had handled it, and which investigative steps had already been completed. The murders also left a lasting impact on the communities connected to the case. Public reporting from the period reflects the concern felt by residents in both British Columbia and Washington state. The victims were young, their journey had appeared routine, and no publicly established motive explained why they had become targets. This apparent randomness heightened public attention and reinforced the determination of investigators to continue pursuing every available lead. Families, friends, and members of the community marked each passing anniversary, hoping that advances in science or investigative methods would eventually provide the answers that had remained beyond reach since 1987. Looking back, the third phase of the investigation demonstrates the importance of persistence even when progress appears limited. Detectives did not solve the case during these early years, but they accomplished something equally important. They documented evidence carefully, maintained the integrity of the investigation, preserved biological material according to forensic standards, and ensured that future investigators would inherit a case file capable of supporting renewed scientific examination. Those decisions, made without knowledge of the forensic breakthroughs that would emerge decades later, ultimately laid the groundwork for the investigation's eventual resolution. By the early 1990s, the investigation into the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg had entered a phase familiar to many major cold case inquiries. The urgency that defines the first weeks of a homicide investigation had inevitably given way to a slower, more deliberate process of evidence review, follow-up interviews, and periodic reassessment. Although public attention gradually diminished, the case remained open. Detectives continued to believe that the offender could eventually be identified, but they also recognized that every immediate investigative lead available at the time had been thoroughly explored. The challenge was no longer collecting new information at a rapid pace. It was determining whether previously gathered evidence might reveal additional answers as forensic science and investigative methods continued to evolve. One of the defining characteristics of the investigation during this period was the careful preservation of physical evidence. Crime scene specialists and evidence custodians maintained biological samples, clothing, trace evidence, photographs, laboratory reports, and investigative documentation under established evidence management procedures. Such work rarely receives public attention, yet it is fundamental to every successful cold case investigation. Proper evidence preservation ensures that future scientific advances can be applied to material collected years or even decades earlier. In the Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation, those routine administrative responsibilities would later prove invaluable. Detectives also revisited witness statements collected during the original investigation. Cold case reviews frequently involve comparing earlier interviews with later recollections, identifying inconsistencies, confirming timelines, and determining whether any information overlooked during the initial inquiry deserves renewed attention. Publicly available records indicate that investigators continued examining reports generated during the first months of the investigation, recognizing that seemingly minor details occasionally become more significant when viewed alongside newly developed evidence. Although these reviews did not immediately identify the offender, they ensured that the investigative record remained comprehensive and organized for future detectives. At the same time, forensic science itself was changing rapidly. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, DNA analysis was still developing into a practical investigative tool. As laboratory techniques improved, law enforcement agencies across North America began reevaluating biological evidence from older homicide investigations. Samples previously considered unsuitable for testing could sometimes produce usable genetic information through newer analytical methods. The detectives responsible for the Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation therefore maintained close communication with forensic laboratories regarding advances that might justify additional examination of the preserved evidence. The emergence of national DNA databases represented another important development. Systems such as the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, expanded investigators' ability to compare crime scene DNA profiles with DNA lawfully collected from qualifying offenders. For many homicide investigations, these databases produced significant breakthroughs by identifying suspects who had previously remained unknown. Investigators handling the Cook and Van Cuylenborg case repeatedly compared available forensic profiles against the expanding databases whenever appropriate opportunities arose. Despite these efforts, no matching profile was identified. This outcome highlighted an important limitation of database searching. A comparison can succeed only if the responsible individual's DNA is already present within the system. Rather than interpreting the absence of a match as a failure, investigators understood that it simply reflected the available information. The unknown DNA profile remained valuable because it represented a reliable forensic reference that could be compared again whenever databases expanded or additional scientific methods became available. Every unsuccessful comparison eliminated possibilities while preserving the opportunity for future identification. The investigation also demonstrated the importance of institutional continuity. Personnel inevitably changed over the years as detectives retired, accepted new assignments, or transferred to other agencies. Cold case investigations, therefore, depend heavily upon detailed documentation. Every report prepared by the original investigators, every evidence inventory, every laboratory submission, and every interview summary enabled subsequent detectives to understand precisely what had been done and why. Instead of restarting the investigation from the beginning, each new investigative team built upon the work completed by its predecessors. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, advances in forensic biology steadily improved the quality of DNA profiles that laboratories could develop from preserved evidence. Improved extraction methods, more sensitive amplification techniques, and increasingly sophisticated analytical instruments allowed scientists to recover genetic information that earlier technologies could not reliably detect. Public records indicate that the biological evidence preserved from the Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation benefited from these advances, producing increasingly complete forensic DNA profiles suitable for comparison. Yet despite these improvements, investigators still face the same central obstacle. They possess the offender's DNA profile, but not the offender's identity. The case became an example of a broader reality confronting homicide investigators around the world. Scientific advances had solved many previously unsolved crimes, but some investigations continued to resist resolution because existing databases simply contained no matching individual. Detectives remained convinced that preserving the evidence and periodically reassessing the case offered the best chance of eventual success. Their patience reflected an understanding shared by experienced cold case investigators. Scientific progress often creates opportunities that cannot be predicted years in advance. For the victims' families, the passing decades brought continuing uncertainty. Public statements made over the years reflected enduring hope that the investigation would one day produce answers while acknowledging the emotional difficulty of waiting through repeated anniversaries without resolution. Law enforcement agencies maintained communication with family members whenever significant developments occurred, recognizing that unresolved homicide investigations affect relatives long after media attention has faded. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation also influenced the culture of evidence preservation within law enforcement. As more agencies recognized the long-term value of biological evidence, policies increasingly emphasized secure storage, careful documentation, and periodic review of unsolved homicide files. Detectives understood that even when current technology could not identify an offender, future scientific developments might transform preserved evidence into the key to solving a decades-old case. Looking back, this period of the investigation may appear uneventful when compared with the dramatic forensic breakthrough that eventually followed. In reality, it represented one of the most important phases of the case. Investigators maintained the integrity of the evidence, preserved institutional knowledge through detailed documentation, embraced advances in forensic science as they emerged, and refused to classify the murders as permanently unsolvable. Those decisions ensured that when a new investigative method eventually became available decades later, the Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation remained fully prepared to benefit from it. The years between the original crimes and the ultimate breakthrough were not years of inactivity. They were years of careful stewardship, patient review, and unwavering commitment to preserving the possibility of justice. By the early 2010s, the investigation into the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg had become one of Washington state's longest-running unsolved homicide cases. More than 2 decades had passed since the crimes, yet investigators continued to believe that the preserved physical evidence still held answers. Advances in forensic biology during the preceding years had already transformed many cold case investigations across North America. DNA profiling had become significantly more sensitive and reliable than it had been in the late 1980s, allowing laboratories to recover useful genetic information from evidence that previously could not be analyzed in detail. As these scientific capabilities expanded, detectives responsible for the Cook and Van Queilenborg case once again revisited the evidence collected during the original investigation. Cold case reviews are rarely dramatic events. They involve systematic examination of archived reports, laboratory records, photographs, evidence inventories, and witness statements. Detectives reassess investigative decisions made years earlier, not because they assume mistakes occurred, but because new technologies often allow old evidence to be interpreted differently. In this investigation, preserved biological evidence remained the most promising source of information. Earlier examinations had established the presence of DNA associated with an unknown male, but repeated comparisons against available criminal DNA databases had failed to identify the individual responsible. Rather than viewing that outcome as a dead end, investigators recognized that the DNA profile itself remained valuable. It represented an unknown person whose identity might eventually become discoverable through future scientific methods. During this period, forensic laboratories continued improving DNA extraction and analysis techniques. Better instrumentation, refined laboratory protocols, and advances in genetic analysis produced increasingly complete DNA profiles from preserved evidence. Publicly available information indicates that the biological evidence from the 1987 investigation benefited from these improvements, providing investigators with a high-quality genetic profile suitable for further examination. Nevertheless, the central obstacle remained unchanged. The offender's DNA was still absent from conventional law enforcement databases. At the same time, another scientific development was beginning to attract attention within the forensic community. Genetic genealogy had long been used by individuals researching family history, ancestry, and biological relationships. Millions of people voluntarily submitted DNA samples to genealogy services in order to learn more about their family origins or connect with relatives. Researchers recognized that these large collections of voluntarily shared genetic information could sometimes identify distant biological relationships between individuals who had never met. Initially, these methods were developed for genealogical research rather than criminal investigations. However, forensic specialists began exploring whether similar techniques might generate investigative leads in cases where traditional DNA database searches had failed. Law enforcement agencies approached these developments cautiously. Investigative genetic genealogy represented an entirely different approach from conventional forensic DNA comparisons. Instead of seeking an exact match between crime scene DNA and an existing offender profile, genealogical analysis looked for individuals who shared inherited DNA with the unknown contributor. Such relationships might involve distant cousins or other extended family members rather than the individual being sought. Detectives understood that genealogy could not establish guilt or identify an offender by itself. Instead, it offered the possibility of narrowing an enormous population into a smaller number of biologically related family lines that could then be examined through traditional investigative methods. Before employing any new forensic approach, investigators first ensured that the evidence itself remained suitable for additional analysis. Laboratory scientists carefully evaluated preserved biological samples to determine whether sufficient genetic material remained available. Because the original evidence had been collected and stored according to accepted forensic standards, it retained its scientific value despite the passage of decades. This fact underscored one of the most important lessons of the investigation. Evidence preservation is not simply an administrative responsibility, but a critical component of long-term criminal investigation. Detectives also reviewed every aspect of the original case file before pursuing new forensic strategies. They examined timelines, witness interviews, crime scene reports, and previous laboratory findings to ensure that any future investigative lead could be evaluated within the broader factual context of the case. Cold case investigations require balancing new scientific possibilities with established investigative principles. Every potential lead must be tested against documented evidence rather than replacing it. Investigators therefore prepared to integrate emerging forensic methods into the existing case rather than treating technology as a substitute for detective work. As scientific interest in investigative genetic genealogy continued to grow, several agencies across the United States began evaluating whether the technique might assist in particularly challenging unsolved homicide investigations involving preserved DNA evidence. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg possessed many of the characteristics that made such an approach potentially valuable. The biological evidence had been preserved carefully. Laboratory analysis had produced a reliable DNA profile, and conventional database searches had repeatedly failed despite years of investigation. These factors made the case a strong candidate for renewed forensic examination once appropriate expertise became available. Throughout this period, detectives remained mindful that scientific innovation alone could not solve the investigation. Even if genealogy identified a possible family connection, investigators would still need to conduct independent research, verify historical records, identify individuals whose documented circumstances aligned with the known facts of the case, and ultimately obtain legally admissible evidence capable of supporting criminal prosecution. The standards governing homicide investigations had not changed. New technology could generate investigative opportunities, but every conclusion still required careful verification through established investigative procedures. For the families of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg, the continued work offered cautious optimism. Public statements over the years reflected appreciation that investigators had never abandoned the case despite the extraordinary passage of time. Every scientific advance created renewed hope that the preserved evidence might finally reveal the identity of the person responsible. Investigators, however, remained careful not to promise results that science could not yet guarantee. Experience had taught them that cold case investigations demand patience, persistence, and respect for the evidence above all else. Looking back, this stage of the investigation represented the moment when decades of careful evidence preservation finally began intersecting with a new era of forensic science. The original detectives had preserved biological evidence without knowing that investigative genetic genealogy would one day exist. Successive investigators had maintained that evidence through repeated reviews, laboratory testing, and secure storage. By the middle of the 2010 estimate, the investigation stood at the threshold of a breakthrough made possible by the combined efforts of generations of detectives and scientists. The answers had not yet emerged, but for the first time in many years, investigators possessed a realistic opportunity to pursue an entirely new direction, one that would eventually transform a 31-year-old cold case into one of the landmark investigations in the history of modern forensic genetics. The turning point in the investigation came not through a confession, a newly discovered eyewitness, or the recovery of previously unknown physical evidence, but through a significant advance in forensic science. More than 30 years after the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg, investigators began applying a method that had only recently emerged as a practical investigative tool: investigative genetic genealogy, commonly referred to as EG. Although the technique would later receive widespread public attention following several high-profile cold case investigations, its use in the Cook and Van Cuylenborg case reflected years of scientific development, careful legal consideration, and collaboration between detectives, forensic laboratories, and professional genealogists. The investigation began with evidence that had existed since 1987. During the original homicide investigation, crime scene specialists recovered biological material associated with the offender. At the time, forensic DNA technology was still in its infancy, limiting what scientists could accomplish with the available samples. As laboratory methods improved over the following decades, scientists were able to develop a more complete DNA profile from the preserved evidence. Repeated comparisons against the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, and other law enforcement databases, however, produced no match. This result indicated only that the unknown individual was not represented within those databases. It did not diminish the value of the DNA profile itself. Investigative genetic genealogy approached the problem differently. Instead of searching exclusively for the individual who left the DNA, the technique searched for biological relatives who had voluntarily submitted their genetic information to genealogy databases that permitted law enforcement access under applicable policies at the time. The objective was not to identify a suspect immediately, but to discover distant family relationships that could provide investigators with new investigative leads. Even a third or fourth cousin could help genealogists begin reconstructing family trees leading toward the unknown individual. Before genealogy could begin, forensic scientists ensured that the crime scene DNA profile met the technical requirements necessary for genealogical comparison. Unlike traditional forensic DNA profiles used within criminal databases, Genealogy requires a much larger number of genetic markers to identify distant familial relationships. Laboratory specialists therefore generated a profile suitable for genealogical analysis while maintaining the integrity of the original forensic evidence. This process required careful quality control because every subsequent investigative step depended upon the accuracy of the genetic data. Professional genealogists then assumed an essential role. Using the uploaded genetic profile, they identified individuals who appeared to share inherited DNA with the unknown contributor. These individuals were not suspects. Most had no knowledge that their voluntarily submitted DNA might one day assist a criminal investigation. Instead, they represented distant biological relatives whose shared ancestry could help investigators reconstruct extended family connections. Genealogists examined publicly available historical records, including birth certificates, marriage records, census documents, obituaries, cemetery records, newspaper archives, military records, and other genealogical resources. Their task resembled assembling an enormous historical puzzle in which thousands of individuals might ultimately connect through common ancestors. As family trees expanded across multiple generations, genealogists searched for branches consistent with the known characteristics of the unknown offender. Detectives contributed by providing non-genetic investigative information, including the approximate age range suggested by the investigation, geographic considerations, and other facts established through decades of police work. This collaboration between genealogy and traditional investigation allowed the enormous family tree to be narrowed gradually to a smaller number of individuals whose documented histories merited closer examination. Publicly available court records indicate that this process eventually directed investigators toward William Earl Talbot II. At that stage, genealogy had not identified him as the offender. Rather, it had identified him as an individual whose family relationships and background justified further investigation. Detectives therefore shifted from genealogical research back to conventional police work. They reviewed publicly available records, confirmed historical information, examined where Talbot had lived during the relevant period, and evaluated whether additional investigative steps were warranted. Throughout this process, investigators remained mindful that genealogy alone could not establish criminal responsibility. The next step involved obtaining a legally admissible DNA sample for direct comparison. Rather than requesting a sample immediately, detectives conducted surveillance and recovered an item that Talbot had discarded in a public place. Under established legal principles governing abandoned property, investigators submitted the recovered biological material to a forensic laboratory for analysis. Scientists then compared the DNA profile obtained from the discarded item with the preserved crime scene DNA profile developed from evidence collected in 1987. According to court testimony and publicly available records, the comparison produced a match. This result represented the first direct forensic connection between the unknown biological evidence recovered decades earlier and an identified individual. Importantly, the evidentiary value of the case did not rest upon genealogical research itself. Investigative genetic genealogy had generated an investigative lead. The legally significant evidence presented in court consisted of the direct forensic DNA comparison between the crime scene evidence and the DNA obtained independently during the renewed investigation. The identification of a suspect marked a remarkable milestone, but investigators understood that their work was far from complete. They carefully reviewed every aspect of the case once again, ensuring that the developing evidence remained consistent with witness statements, crime scene findings, timelines, and previously documented investigative facts. Detectives recognized that successful homicide prosecutions require more than identifying a suspect. Every stage of the investigation must withstand judicial scrutiny, forensic review, and adversarial testing during criminal proceedings. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation quickly became one of the most closely studied examples of investigative genetic genealogy in practice. Law enforcement agencies, forensic scientists, prosecutors, legal scholars, and policymakers examined the investigation to better understand both the opportunities and responsibilities associated with the new technique. The case demonstrated that genealogy should not be viewed as a replacement for conventional investigation, but rather as an additional investigative tool capable of generating leads when traditional methods have reached their limits. Every subsequent step from surveillance to DNA collection, laboratory comparison, arrest, and prosecution continued to rely upon established investigative procedures and accepted rules of evidence. For the families of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Queilenborg, the scientific breakthrough represented the first substantial investigative progress in more than 3 decades. Although the criminal justice process still lay ahead, the identification of a suspect demonstrated that the evidence preserved in 1987 had retained its value despite the passage of time. It also validated the persistence of generations of investigators who had continued safeguarding the evidence while waiting for forensic science to reach a point where questions unanswered for 31 years could finally be addressed through objective scientific analysis. Following the successful identification of William Earl Talbot III through investigative genetic genealogy and subsequent forensic DNA comparison, the investigation entered a critical new phase. For the first time in more than 30 years, detectives were no longer searching broadly for an unknown offender. Instead, they focused on confirming whether the available evidence, when considered collectively, established probable cause for arrest. Experienced homicide investigators understood that identifying a potential suspect represented only one step in a much larger legal process. Every investigative conclusion had to be supported by admissible evidence capable of withstanding examination in court. The transition from cold case investigation to active criminal prosecution therefore required careful planning, extensive documentation, and close cooperation between investigators, forensic scientists, and prosecutors. Before making an arrest, detectives reviewed the entire investigative file assembled since 1987. Cold case investigations often involve thousands of pages of reports accumulated over decades, including crime scene documentation, witness interviews, laboratory analyses, photographic evidence, maps, correspondence between agencies, and records of every significant investigative decision. Reviewing this material served several purposes. Investigators verified that the newly developed DNA evidence remained consistent with earlier findings, confirmed that no previously overlooked information conflicted with the emerging theory of the case, and prepared to explain decades of investigative history clearly to prosecutors and, eventually, to a jury. At the same time, forensic scientists completed additional analyses designed to confirm the reliability of the DNA comparison. Modern forensic laboratories operate under rigorous quality assurance standards intended to ensure that analytical conclusions are scientifically reliable and reproducible. Laboratory personnel documented every stage of the testing process, maintained detailed records regarding evidence handling, and verified that the biological material collected during the renewed investigation corresponded to the preserved crime scene evidence. Such procedures are essential because forensic DNA evidence frequently becomes one of the most closely examined aspects of homicide trials. The role of prosecutors also expanded significantly during this period. Before criminal charges are filed, prosecutors evaluate the available evidence to determine whether legal standards for prosecution have been satisfied. This evaluation extends beyond scientific findings alone. Prosecutors review witness testimony, investigative reports, laboratory documentation, chain of custody records, and applicable legal requirements governing the collection and admissibility of evidence. In the Cook and Van Queilenborg investigation, prosecutors worked closely with investigators to ensure that every significant piece of evidence had been properly documented and that the investigative process complied with constitutional and statutory requirements. Publicly available records indicate that investigators arrested William Earl Talbot III in 2018. The arrest marked the first major public breakthrough in a case that had remained unsolved for more than 3 decades. Law enforcement agencies announced the development through official statements explaining that advances in forensic science and investigative genetic genealogy had contributed to identifying a suspect. The announcement generated widespread national and international media attention because the investigation illustrated the emerging potential of advanced forensic techniques to resolve long unsolved homicides. For the families of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Queilenborg, the arrest represented an important moment after decades of uncertainty. Family members publicly expressed appreciation for the investigators, forensic scientists, and prosecutors whose persistence had brought the case to this stage. At the same time, they recognized that an arrest did not conclude the criminal justice process. Under the legal system, every defendant is presumed innocent unless proven guilty in court. The forthcoming trial would therefore determine whether the evidence established guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The case also attracted considerable attention within the forensic and law enforcement communities. Agencies responsible for other unsolved homicide investigations carefully examined the investigative methods employed in the Cook and Van Queilenborg case. The detectives recognized that while investigative genetic genealogy had generated a valuable lead, the investigation ultimately depended upon a combination of scientific evidence and traditional police work. Surveillance, evidence collection, forensic comparison, documentation, legal review, and prosecutorial preparation all contributed to the case moving successfully toward trial. Investigators continued preparing for courtroom proceedings by organizing evidence in a manner suitable for presentation before a jury. Crime scene photographs, laboratory reports, witness testimony, maps, timelines, and forensic exhibits required careful review and coordination. Detectives anticipated that they would be called upon to explain investigative decisions made both recently and decades earlier. Because many original investigators had retired, subsequent detectives familiarized themselves with historical reports and consulted earlier documentation to ensure continuity in the presentation of evidence. An important aspect of trial preparation involved explaining investigative genetic genealogy accurately. Prosecutors anticipated that jurors would need to understand the distinction between genealogy as an investigative tool and the forensic DNA evidence ultimately presented during trial. Investigative genetic genealogy had assisted investigators in identifying a potential suspect through biological relatives, but it was the direct comparison between the preserved crime scene DNA and Talbot's DNA that constituted the principal. Forensic evidence. This distinction reflected an important legal principle. Investigative techniques may generate leads, but criminal convictions require admissible evidence establishing the defendant's connection to the crime. The investigation also prompted broader discussions concerning forensic innovation and responsible investigative practice. Law enforcement leaders emphasized that investigative genetic genealogy should be used selectively, particularly in serious violent crimes where conventional investigative methods had been exhausted and preserved biological evidence existed. Agencies considering similar techniques increasingly developed written policies governing approvals, documentation, privacy considerations, and legal oversight. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation therefore contributed not only to resolving an individual homicide case, but also to shaping emerging professional standards for the responsible application of advanced forensic technology. As preparations for trial continued, investigators reflected upon the extraordinary duration of the investigation. More than 30 years separated the original crimes from the identification of a suspect. During that period, scientific capabilities had changed dramatically. Numerous investigators had contributed to the case, and generations of family members had continued waiting for answers. The investigation demonstrated that persistence, careful evidence preservation, and willingness to embrace scientifically validated methods could combine to overcome obstacles that once appeared insurmountable. By the time prosecutors completed their preparation for trial, the Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation had already become an important case study in modern criminal investigation. It illustrated how disciplined police work performed in 1987 remained essential decades later, how advances in forensic science could transform preserved biological evidence into powerful investigative tools, and how emerging technologies must always operate within established legal procedures. The next phase of the case would shift from the investigative arena to the courtroom, where forensic evidence, witness testimony, and legal argument would be examined through the adversarial process before an impartial jury charged with determining whether the prosecution had proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The criminal trial marked the first time in more than 3 decades that the evidence collected during the investigation would be presented and examined in a courtroom. For investigators, forensic scientists, prosecutors, defense attorneys, the victims' families, and the defendant, the proceedings represented the culmination of years of investigative work and legal preparation. Unlike the investigative phase, where detectives could continue exploring multiple theories simultaneously, a criminal trial requires that evidence be presented according to established rules of procedure and evidence. Every exhibit, every witness, and every scientific conclusion must withstand examination before an impartial jury responsible for determining whether the prosecution has established guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution's case centered primarily on forensic evidence, supported by testimony from investigators and laboratory specialists. Prosecutors explained that the investigation had remained unsolved for decades despite repeated efforts because the offender's DNA was not represented in traditional law enforcement databases. They described how advances in forensic science eventually allowed investigators to apply investigative genetic genealogy as an investigative lead, ultimately identifying William Earl Talbot II as a person requiring further investigation. Importantly, prosecutors distinguished between genealogy and the evidence presented at trial. They emphasized that genealogy generated an investigative lead, while the principal forensic evidence consisted of a direct DNA comparison between preserved biological evidence collected in 1987 and DNA later obtained from Talbot. Crime scene investigators testified regarding the original collection of evidence during the homicide investigation. Their testimony focused on the procedures used to secure the crime scenes, document physical evidence, preserve biological material, and maintain the chain of custody. Chain of custody is a fundamental principle in criminal proceedings because it establishes that evidence presented in court is the same evidence originally collected and that it has remained protected from contamination or alteration throughout the investigation. Prosecutors presented documentation demonstrating how the biological evidence had been stored, transferred, and analyzed over the course of more than 30 years. Forensic scientists explained the laboratory methods used during successive stages of the investigation. Witnesses described how improvements in DNA technology allowed increasingly detailed genetic profiles to be developed from the preserved biological evidence. They explained the scientific principles underlying DNA comparison, quality assurance procedures employed within accredited forensic laboratories, and the methods used to verify analytical results. Expert witnesses also addressed the distinction between forensic DNA profiling used in criminal investigations and the broader genetic analysis employed during investigative genetic genealogy. According to court records, the experts testified that the genealogy process itself did not establish criminal responsibility, but instead directed investigators toward an individual whose DNA was subsequently compared directly with the preserved crime scene evidence. The prosecution also presented testimony from detectives who had participated in the renewed investigation. These witnesses described how investigators reviewed decades of case files, coordinated with forensic laboratories and genealogical specialists, and conducted surveillance before recovering a discarded item that provided a DNA sample for comparison. The detectives explained the investigative steps undertaken after genealogy suggested a possible family connection, emphasizing that each subsequent action followed conventional investigative procedures. Their testimony demonstrated that scientific innovation supplemented rather than replaced traditional police work. The defense counsel exercised its role by carefully examining the prosecution's evidence and questioning witnesses through cross-examination. Publicly available records indicate that the defense challenged aspects of the state's case, including the interpretation of forensic evidence and investigative procedures. Defense attorneys questioned witnesses regarding laboratory analyses, evidence handling, and the investigative process leading to the identification of the defendant. Such examination forms an essential component of the adversarial legal system because it allows both sides to test the reliability and credibility of the evidence presented to the jury. The court also addressed legal issues concerning investigative genetic genealogy. Because the technique represented a relatively recent investigative development, judges considered questions regarding the admissibility and relevance of testimony describing how investigators generated the initial lead. As reflected in public court records, the legal proceedings distinguish between the genealogy process itself and the independently obtained forensic DNA evidence introduced during trial. This distinction reinforced an important legal principle. Investigative methods may direct detectives toward potential suspects, but criminal convictions must ultimately rest upon admissible evidence presented according to established legal standards. Throughout the proceedings, prosecutors bore the burden of proof. Under the American criminal justice system, every defendant is presumed innocent unless the prosecution establishes guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. This standard protects the integrity of the judicial process by requiring jurors to evaluate the evidence carefully before reaching a verdict. Jurors therefore listened to testimony from investigators, forensic scientists, and other witnesses, examined documentary exhibits, and received legal instructions from the court concerning the applicable law. Their responsibility was to assess the evidence presented during trial rather than media coverage or public opinion surrounding the case. Following the presentation of evidence and closing arguments, the jury retired to deliberate. Deliberations occur privately, allowing jurors to discuss the evidence, review exhibits, and determine whether the prosecution has satisfied its burden of proof. Publicly available court records indicate that the jury ultimately returned guilty verdicts on 2 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. The verdict represented the conclusion reached by the jurors after evaluating the evidence presented throughout the trial under the legal instructions provided by the court. After the verdict, the court imposed sentence in accordance with Washington law. William Earl Talbot II received 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. As in many serious criminal cases, the proceedings did not conclude with sentencing alone. The defendant exercised the right to appellate review, allowing higher courts to examine legal issues raised during the trial. Appeals are a routine component of the criminal justice system and focus on whether legal errors occurred during the proceedings rather than conducting a new factual determination of guilt or innocence. Beyond its immediate legal outcome, the trial became an important reference point for prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, and investigators involved in future cold case prosecutions. It demonstrated how scientific advances could be introduced within established legal frameworks while preserving the procedural safeguards fundamental to criminal justice. The proceedings illustrated the importance of detailed evidence preservation, comprehensive documentation, expert forensic testimony, and careful judicial oversight when presenting complex scientific evidence before a jury. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg trial also reinforced a broader lesson for cold case investigations worldwide. Scientific breakthroughs alone do not resolve criminal cases. Every forensic conclusion must be translated into evidence that satisfies legal standards governing admissibility, reliability, and due process. The courtroom, therefore, became the final stage of an investigation that had begun in 1987, connecting decades of detective work, scientific advancement, and legal procedure within a single judicial process. By the conclusion of the trial, the case had become both a significant homicide prosecution and a landmark example of how evolving forensic science can operate effectively within the established institutions of the criminal justice system. For many observers, the most remarkable aspect of the Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation was not simply that a suspect was identified after more than 3 decades, but how that identification became possible. The answer lay in a forensic technique that did not exist when the murders occurred in 1987, investigative genetic genealogy, commonly known as IGG. Although often discussed alongside forensic DNA analysis, IGG is not a replacement for conventional forensic science. Instead, it is an investigative method that combines modern genetics, traditional genealogy, historical research, and police investigation to generate leads in cases where standard DNA database searches have failed. Understanding how this process works is essential to understanding why the Cook and Van Cuylenborg case became one of the landmark investigations in the history of modern cold case policing. Traditional forensic DNA investigations generally begin with biological evidence recovered from a crime scene. Scientists analyze this evidence and develop a forensic DNA profile using genetic markers that are highly effective for identifying individuals. That profile is then compared against law enforcement databases containing DNA lawfully collected from qualifying offenders or other authorized sources. If a matching profile exists, investigators may identify a suspect quickly. If no match is found, however, the investigation often reaches a significant obstacle. This was precisely the situation confronting detectives in the Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation. The biological evidence produced a usable DNA profile, yet repeated searches of conventional databases over many years failed to identify the person who had left it. Investigative genetic genealogy approaches the problem from an entirely different perspective. Rather than searching only for the unknown individual, it searches for biological relatives who have voluntarily submitted DNA to genealogy services that permit appropriate law enforcement use under their applicable policies. The objective is not to identify the offender immediately, but to locate individuals who share inherited DNA with the unknown contributor. Even distant relatives, such as third or fourth cousins, can provide enough genetic information to begin reconstructing extended family relationships. The first technical step requires the creation of a DNA profile suitable for genealogical comparison. This differs from the profile routinely used in criminal investigations. Genealogy relies upon hundreds of thousands of genetic markers distributed throughout the genome, rather than the smaller number used for forensic identification. Specialized laboratory procedures therefore convert suitable crime scene DNA into a format capable of supporting genealogical analysis. This process requires sufficient biological material and careful quality control because incomplete or inaccurate data can complicate later family tree reconstruction. Once the genealogical profile has been prepared, analysts compare it with profiles submitted voluntarily by individuals interested in family history research. These people are not suspects, witnesses, or persons of investigative interest. Most have no connection to the crime whatsoever. They simply share portions of inherited DNA because they descend from common ancestors, sometimes several generations removed. The amount of shared DNA allows genealogists to estimate the likely degree of biological relationship between the unknown contributor and each genetic match. At this stage, professional genealogists begin extensive historical research. Their work resembles academic historical investigation as much as criminal investigation. Using publicly available records, including birth certificates, marriage records, death certificates, census documents, newspaper archives, military records, cemetery information, probate records, and family histories, they reconstruct family trees extending backward and forward across multiple generations. The objective is to identify the common ancestors shared by individuals who appear in the DNA matches and then trace all known descendants of those ancestors. Family tree reconstruction frequently involves thousands of individuals. Genealogists document marriages, children, geographic movements, name changes, and relationships spanning more than a century. Each new historical record contributes another piece to an increasingly detailed picture of how multiple families connect biologically. Because genetic matches are often distant relatives, investigators cannot simply identify one individual and assume that person is responsible. Instead, genealogy narrows an enormous population into a manageable number of related family lines, requiring further investigation. Traditional detective work then becomes essential. Investigators examine the family tree alongside known facts established during the homicide investigation. They consider factors such as age, sex, geographic history, documented residences, and other information already supported by evidence. Individuals who clearly could not have committed the offense, for example, because of age or documented location, are eliminated. Detectives continue narrowing the possibilities until one or more individuals warrant additional investigation. Importantly, genealogy itself does not establish guilt. It simply provides investigative leads generated through biological relationships. Public court records indicate that this process eventually directed investigators toward William Earl Talbot II. Even at this point, detectives did not consider genealogy sufficient evidence for arrest. Instead, they sought an independent DNA sample suitable for direct forensic comparison. Investigators conducted surveillance and recovered biological material from an item Talbot had discarded in a public place. A forensic laboratory then compared that DNA directly with the preserved biological evidence collected during the original homicide investigation. According to the evidence presented in court, the profiles matched. This direct forensic comparison, not the genealogical research itself, formed the principal scientific evidence connecting Talbot to the crimes. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation illustrates an important distinction frequently misunderstood in public discussions of investigative genetic genealogy. IG does not identify an offender with certainty. It generates investigative leads by identifying biological relationships. Every lead must then be verified through conventional police investigation, legally obtained evidence, and direct forensic testing. Cortez evaluate the admissibility of the independently obtained forensic evidence rather than relying upon genealogy alone. This distinction preserves the established principles governing criminal investigations while allowing investigators to benefit from advances in genetic science. The case also demonstrated the importance of interdisciplinary collaboration. Successful investigative genetic genealogy requires expertise from multiple professions. Forensic biologists develop reliable DNA profiles. Genealogists reconstruct complex family relationships using historical records. Detectives evaluate investigative leads and conduct conventional police work. Prosecutors assess legal requirements governing evidence collection and courtroom presentation. Laboratory quality assurance personnel verify scientific procedures. Each discipline contributes specialized knowledge that no single investigator could provide independently. Following the successful resolution of the Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation, law enforcement agencies throughout North America expanded their evaluation of cold cases involving preserved biological evidence. Agencies established specialized cold case units, partnered with forensic genealogy experts, and developed written policies governing when and how investigative genetic genealogy should be used. Professional organizations also published best practice recommendations emphasizing transparency, documentation, scientific validation, and compliance with applicable legal standards. At the same time, policymakers, courts, and privacy advocates engaged in broader discussions concerning the responsible use of genealogical information during criminal investigations. These discussions focused on balancing the public interest in solving serious violent crimes with the privacy expectations of individuals who voluntarily participate in genealogy services. As investigative genetic genealogy became more widely used, many genealogy platforms revised their policies to clarify whether and under what circumstances law enforcement could access genetic information. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation became one of the important real-world examples informing these ongoing conversations. Ultimately, the significance of investigative genetic genealogy extends beyond any single homicide investigation. The method has demonstrated that carefully preserved evidence can acquire entirely new investigative value as science advances. Yet the Cook and Van Cuylenborg case also reinforces an equally important principle. Scientific innovation does not replace the fundamentals of criminal investigation. Evidence must still be collected lawfully, analyzed rigorously, documented carefully, and presented transparently within the judicial process. Investigative genetic genealogy succeeds not because it bypasses traditional investigative methods, but because it complements them, allowing decades-old evidence to answer questions that once appeared impossible to resolve. Looking back after more than 3 decades, the original investigation into the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg provides an important opportunity to examine how homicide investigations are conducted, how forensic science has evolved, and why some cases remain unresolved despite extensive investigative effort. It is easy, with the benefit of modern technology, to assume that investigators in 1987 missed obvious opportunities. The historical record, however, suggests a different conclusion. Publicly available investigative records and court proceedings indicate that detectives pursued the evidence available to them using the scientific methods and investigative practices of their time. The ultimate resolution of the case did not reveal a failure of the original investigation as much as it demonstrated the limitations of the technology that existed when the crimes occurred. The first investigators responded under extremely challenging circumstances. The disappearance quickly became an international investigation involving law enforcement agencies in both Canada and the United States. Within days, detectives were managing multiple crime scenes, coordinating searches across different jurisdictions, interviewing witnesses, processing the victim's vehicle, and attempting to reconstruct the final movements of 2 victims who had crossed an international border. Each of these tasks required coordination among agencies operating under different administrative structures while maintaining a consistent investigative strategy. Crime scene processing became one of the defining strengths of the original investigation. Detectives and forensic specialists secured each recovery location, photographed the scenes, documented physical evidence, collected biological material, and maintained detailed chain of custody records. At the time, investigators could not know which items of evidence would eventually become significant. Consequently, they collected and preserved a wide range of material that might later assist the investigation. This comprehensive approach reflected a fundamental principle of homicide investigation: preserve everything that may become relevant because future scientific developments cannot be predicted. One of the most valuable decisions made during the original investigation involved the preservation of biological evidence. In 1987, forensic DNA analysis was still emerging as a practical investigative tool. Although scientists recognized its potential, the technology available at the time lacked the sensitivity, speed, and analytical capability that later became standard. Investigators therefore preserved biological samples according to accepted forensic protocols, ensuring that they remained available for future testing. Decades later, those preserved samples became the foundation of the investigation's eventual resolution. Without careful evidence, preservation during the original investigation, later advances in DNA analysis and investigative genetic genealogy could not have been applied. The original investigative team also conducted an extensive witness canvass. Detectives interviewed family members, friends, business employees, residents near the recovery locations, motorists, delivery personnel, and numerous members of the public who responded to media appeals. Hundreds of leads required evaluation. Each report had to be compared against established timelines, corroborated where possible, and documented regardless of whether it ultimately proved relevant. Cold case reviews conducted years later demonstrated the importance of this documentation because subsequent investigators could determine precisely which leads had already been investigated and what conclusions had been reached. Another important aspect of the early investigation involved the systematic comparison of the case with other violent crimes occurring in the Pacific Northwest. Detectives considered whether similarities in victim selection, geographic location, or criminal behavior suggested possible links to other offenders. Such comparisons remain standard practice in homicide investigations because serial offenders sometimes operate across multiple jurisdictions. Publicly available records indicate that investigators explored these possibilities thoroughly, but were unable to establish evidence sufficient to connect the murders to another known series of crimes. As forensic DNA technology matured during the 1990s, investigators repeatedly returned to the preserved evidence. Scientists generated increasingly detailed DNA profiles and compared them against expanding law enforcement databases, including the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS. Each comparison represented a renewed investigative opportunity. However, every search produced the same result. No matching offender profile existed within the available databases. Rather than interpreting these unsuccessful searches as investigative failure, detectives understood that the results simply reflected the absence of the offender's DNA from the system. The evidence itself remained scientifically valuable. The evolution of the investigation also illustrates the importance of institutional continuity. Over the course of more than 30 years, numerous detectives, forensic scientists, supervisors, prosecutors, and laboratory personnel contributed to the case. Many original investigators retired long before the case was solved. Their successors relied heavily upon detailed reports, evidence inventories, laboratory documentation, and investigative summaries prepared years earlier. Effective record-keeping allowed each new generation of investigators to build upon previous work rather than repeating it. This continuity preserved both the integrity and efficiency of the investigation across decades. Perhaps the greatest lesson from revisiting the original investigation is the importance of resisting hindsight bias. Scientific breakthroughs achieved decades later can create the false impression that earlier investigators overlooked obvious solutions. In reality, investigative genetic genealogy did not exist in 1987. The laboratory methods required to generate suitable genealogical DNA profiles had not yet been developed. Commercial genealogy databases had not been established, and the computational tools necessary to reconstruct large family trees were unavailable. Detectives cannot employ investigative methods that have not yet been invented. The historical record instead demonstrates that investigators preserved the evidence in a manner that allowed future technologies to succeed once they became available. The Cook and Van Queilenborg investigation also emphasizes the value of periodically reviewing cold case files, rather than assuming that earlier conclusions remain permanently fixed. Experienced investigators recognize that advances in forensic science may justify renewed examination of preserved evidence. Modern cold case units routinely reassess historical investigations whenever significant improvements occur in DNA analysis, digital forensics, forensic genealogy, or other scientific disciplines. This practice reflects an understanding that unresolved cases should remain open to new scientific opportunities rather than being regarded as permanently unsolvable. From an investigative perspective, the case has become a valuable educational resource for law enforcement agencies. Police academies, homicide training programs, and forensic science courses frequently emphasize principles illustrated by the investigation. Preserve evidence comprehensively, document every investigative action, maintain an unbroken chain of custody, coordinate effectively across jurisdictions, and remain willing to revisit evidence as science evolves. These principles apply not only to cold cases, but to every serious criminal investigation. The original detectives who responded in 1987 could not know that more than 30 years would pass before the case reached a courtroom. They could not anticipate the emergence of investigative genetic genealogy or the extraordinary advances that would transform forensic biology. What they could do and what they did was conduct a thorough investigation using the best methods available at the time, preserve evidence with care, document their work comprehensively, and leave future investigators the tools necessary to continue pursuing justice. Looking back from the perspective of modern forensic science, the original investigation stands not as an example of missed opportunity, but as a demonstration of how disciplined police work can preserve the possibility of solving even the most challenging homicide cases long after the original investigation has ended. Before their names became associated with one of North America's most widely studied cold case investigations, Jay Cook and Tanya Van Queilenborg were simply two young people beginning adult life. Every homicide investigation ultimately concerns more than evidence, forensic science, or criminal procedure. Behind every case, file are individuals whose lives were interrupted and families whose futures were permanently changed. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Queilenborg continue to be remembered not only because the investigation eventually led to a landmark use of investigative genetic genealogy, but because two teenagers with ordinary hopes and ambitions never returned home from what was expected to be a routine journey. Jay Cook was 19 years old in November 1987. Publicly available accounts describe him as a dependable young man who maintained a close relationship with his family. He assisted in his father's furnace business, a responsibility that reflected both trust and maturity. The trip to Washington State was connected to delivering furnace parts associated with that business, making the journey an ordinary family obligation rather than an unusual adventure. Those who knew remembered someone willing to help others, someone beginning to establish an independent future while remaining closely connected to his parents and relatives. Like many young adults, he was balancing increasing responsibility with the opportunities that accompany early adulthood. Tanya Van Queilenborg was 18 years old. Family members and friends have described her publicly as a warm, caring, and thoughtful young woman with aspirations typical of someone entering adulthood. She and Jay had been dating, and they shared plans that extended well beyond a single weekend trip. Their families remembered conversations about the future, everyday routines, friendships, work, and ordinary activities that suddenly acquired extraordinary significance after their disappearance. These memories remind investigators and the public that homicide victims should be remembered first for the lives they lived rather than solely for the circumstances surrounding their deaths. The journey into Washington State appeared routine from every available public account. Neither family had reason to believe the trip involved unusual risk. Crossing the border for business or personal travel was common, and the planned route reflected ordinary travel patterns between British Columbia and Washington. Investigators later found no verified evidence suggesting that Jay or Tanya anticipated danger before leaving home. This absence of warning became one of the reasons the case resonated so deeply throughout the Pacific Northwest. The victims did not appear to have knowingly entered a hazardous situation or to have been engaged in activities associated with elevated personal risk. Their experience illustrated the profound uncertainty that sometimes accompanies stranger homicide investigations. For the families, the initial concern developed gradually. Delays during travel can occur for countless ordinary reasons. Vehicles experience mechanical problems, schedules change, and communication is interrupted. As the hours passed without contact, however, routine concern evolved into alarm. Relatives contacted authorities, providing investigators with every available detail concerning travel plans, expected destinations, and the vehicle being used. The transition from missing person investigation to homicide investigation transformed uncertainty into irreversible loss. Public statements made by family members over the years consistently reflected both enduring grief and appreciation for investigators who continued working the case despite the extraordinary passage of time. The emotional consequences of unresolved homicide investigations differ significantly from those associated with cases solved quickly after arrest. Families living through long-term cold cases experience repeated cycles of hope and disappointment. Every scientific advance raises the possibility of new answers. Every renewed investigative review generates cautious optimism. Yet years may pass between significant developments. Parents grow older while waiting for information. Siblings establish families of their own while carrying unanswered questions into each new stage of life. Friends continue remembering birthdays, holidays, and milestones that the victims never had the opportunity to experience. These long-term effects are rarely visible in investigative reports, yet they represent an important aspect of every unresolved homicide investigation. The murders also affected the communities connected to the victims. During the original investigation, newspapers and television stations throughout British Columbia and Washington State reported extensively on the disappearance and subsequent discoveries. Residents followed each development closely, hoping investigators would quickly identify the person responsible. Because the victims appeared to have been engaged in an ordinary trip, many people found the crimes particularly unsettling. Community members recognized that the investigation involved circumstances that could have affected virtually anyone undertaking similar travel. This perception contributed to widespread public interest that continued long after the initial investigation. Throughout the decades that followed, the families maintained contact with law enforcement as the investigation progressed through successive stages of forensic development. Detectives responsible for the cold case recognized the importance of communicating significant developments while avoiding speculation unsupported by evidence. Such communication serves an important purpose beyond providing investigative updates. It demonstrates institutional commitment to families who have often waited years without definitive answers. Maintaining those relationships requires honesty, empathy, and recognition that unresolved homicide investigations impose emotional burdens extending far beyond the criminal justice system itself. When advances in forensic science eventually produced a significant breakthrough, public attention naturally focused on investigative genetic genealogy and the identification of a suspect. Family members, however, frequently emphasized a different perspective in public statements. They expressed gratitude that investigators had never abandoned the case while also encouraging people to remember Jay and Tanya as individuals rather than simply as victims of a famous cold case. Their comments reflected a desire that the legacy of the investigation include recognition of the lives interrupted in 1987, not merely the scientific techniques that later contributed to identifying a suspect. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation has since become an important educational example within forensic science, law enforcement, and legal communities. Yet its lasting significance cannot be measured solely by advances in investigative methodology. Every discussion of DNA technology, genealogy, laboratory analysis, or courtroom procedure ultimately traces back to two young people whose lives ended before they had the opportunity to pursue the futures imagined by their families. This perspective reminds investigators that evidence, however scientifically significant, always represents events experienced by real individuals. For modern detectives, the victims remain central to understanding the importance of persistence in cold case investigations. Solving a homicide is not simply an exercise in scientific achievement. It fulfills a broader responsibility to victims, families, and communities seeking truthful answers supported by reliable evidence. Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg continue to be remembered because their case demonstrates both the possibilities created by scientific progress and the enduring human reasons for pursuing justice, regardless of how much time has passed. Today, more than 3 decades after the crimes, the names Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg remain associated with one of the defining investigations in the history of modern cold case policing. Their story continues to be studied by investigators, forensic scientists, prosecutors, and students of criminal justice, not only because it helped demonstrate the potential of investigative genetic genealogy, but because it underscores the purpose behind every homicide investigation. Scientific advances, careful evidence preservation, meticulous documentation, and persistent detective work ultimately exist for one reason: to seek truthful, evidence-based answers for victims and the families who continue living with the consequences of violent crime long after public attention has faded. Men H. Kling, Vh. Tr. Vitae, Int H. Bien, Theo Fong Ch. Git Gn Hoc Gh Dravi, Int En, Git Ingi Ec that. Nu Yel Ni Dong Cho Mi Video Ti Lu, Dai Ll Fen Mi Hai Theo Fong Ch. Documentary voice over. TP Trung via OCC Chen C LP Lun K Bien, Bio Cha, Qui Tre X XV Din, Bin, VHPLK, VN. Datron CCHS Sim Kai, VFCCS, Kin CXC Min. Following the identification and arrest of William Earl Talbot in 2018, the investigation entered its final judicial phase. For more than 30 years, detectives had worked to identify the unknown individual whose biological evidence had been preserved since the original investigation in 1987. The criminal proceedings that followed shifted the focus from identifying a suspect to determining whether the evidence presented in court satisfied the constitutional requirement that guilt be established beyond a reasonable doubt. The case therefore became not only an examination of forensic science, but also an illustration of how modern criminal courts evaluate scientific evidence, investigative procedures, and competing legal arguments within the framework of due process. The prosecution's case relied heavily upon forensic DNA evidence developed from biological material preserved during the original homicide investigation. Expert witnesses explained how advances in DNA analysis had allowed laboratories to generate increasingly complete genetic profiles from evidence collected decades earlier. They described the scientific procedures used to analyze the crime scene samples, the laboratory quality assurance protocols governing forensic examinations, and the methods employed to compare the preserved evidence with DNA obtained during the renewed investigation. According to publicly available court records, the direct DNA comparison constituted one of the central pieces of evidence presented to the jury. Prosecutors also devoted considerable attention to explaining the role of investigative genetic genealogy, Because the technique was relatively new to many members of the public, the prosecution distinguished carefully between genealogy as an investigative method and forensic DNA analysis as courtroom evidence. Investigative genetic genealogy, they explained, generated an investigative led by identifying biological relatives of the unknown contributor. The detectives then conducted conventional investigative work, obtained an independent DNA sample through lawful means, and submitted that sample for direct forensic comparison with the preserved crime scene evidence. The prosecution emphasized that the convictions sought by the state depended upon admissible forensic evidence rather than genealogical research itself. Detectives involved in the renewed investigation testified regarding the investigative steps taken after genealogical analysis identified a possible family connection. Their testimony described the review of historical case files, surveillance activities, evidence collection procedures, and coordination with forensic laboratories. They explained how every significant investigative action had been documented and how the renewed investigation built upon evidence originally collected in 1987. This testimony illustrated the continuity between the original investigation and the modern forensic work that ultimately identified a suspect more than 3 decades later. Forensic experts further explained the scientific basis for DNA comparison. They described how inherited genetic markers allow scientists to distinguish one individual from another with a very high degree of confidence when sufficient biological material is available. Laboratory witnesses discussed chain of custody procedures, contamination safeguards, independent verification processes, and the accreditation standards governing forensic laboratories. Such testimony sought to demonstrate not only the analytical results, but also the reliability of the methods used to obtain those results. As required by the adversarial legal system, defense counsel subjected the prosecution's evidence to careful examination. Public court records indicate that the defense challenged aspects of the state's case, including the interpretation of forensic evidence and certain investigative procedures. Defense attorneys questioned witnesses regarding laboratory methodology, the handling of biological evidence over several decades, and the investigative process that followed the use of investigative genetic genealogy. Cross-examination serves an important constitutional purpose by allowing the defense to test the credibility, reliability, and completeness of the prosecution's evidence before the jury. The defense also presented arguments intended to create reasonable doubt regarding the prosecution's conclusions. In criminal proceedings, defendants bear no obligation to prove innocence. Instead, the prosecution must establish every element of the charged offenses beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense counsel therefore focused on identifying potential uncertainties, questioning investigative assumptions where appropriate, and encouraging jurors to evaluate the evidence carefully according to the legal instructions provided by the court. This process reflected the fundamental principle that criminal convictions require proof meeting the highest evidentiary standard used within the justice system. Following the presentation of testimony, prosecutors and defense attorneys delivered closing arguments summarizing their respective interpretations of the evidence. Prosecutors argued that the totality of the forensic evidence, investigative findings, and expert testimony established the defendant's responsibility for the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg. Defense counsel argued that jurors should consider whether the evidence presented eliminated reasonable doubt, emphasizing the importance of careful evaluation before reaching a verdict in a case involving crimes committed more than 30 years earlier. The jury subsequently deliberated in private, reviewing exhibits, testimony, and legal instructions before returning its verdict. According to publicly available court records, the jury found William Earl Talbot guilty of 2 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. The verdict represented the jury's determination that the prosecution had satisfied its burden of proof based upon the admissible evidence presented during trial. The court later imposed 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, reflecting the seriousness of the convictions under Washington law. As with many significant criminal cases, the legal process did not conclude immediately after sentencing. The defendant exercised the right to appellate review, an established component of the American judicial system designed to ensure that criminal proceedings comply with constitutional and procedural requirements. During appellate proceedings, higher courts reviewed legal issues raised by the defense concerning aspects of the trial and the admissibility of certain evidence. Appellate review does not ordinarily involve a new determination of factual guilt, but instead examines whether legal errors occurred that may have affected the fairness of the proceedings. One significant development occurred during the appellate process. In 2022, The Washington Supreme Court reversed Talbot's convictions and ordered a new trial. The court concluded that certain testimony admitted during the original trial concerning investigative genetic genealogy should not have been presented in the manner it was because of evidentiary concerns. Importantly, the decision did not conclude that the forensic DNA evidence itself was unreliable, nor did it determine that Talbot was factually innocent. Rather, it reflected the appellate court's responsibility to evaluate whether the trial had complied with applicable evidentiary rules. Such appellate decisions illustrate the distinction between reviewing legal procedure and determining factual responsibility. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg case therefore became significant for two separate reasons. Scientifically, it demonstrated the investigative value of genetic genealogy when combined with conventional detective work and independently obtained forensic evidence. Legally, it highlighted the importance of presenting emerging scientific techniques within established evidentiary frameworks that protect the fairness of criminal proceedings. Cortez, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and investigators have since examined the case closely when considering how novel investigative methods should be introduced during future trials. For modern investigators, the judicial history of the case reinforces an essential lesson. Scientific breakthroughs alone do not guarantee successful prosecution. Evidence must be collected lawfully, analyzed rigorously, documented comprehensively, and presented in accordance with procedural safeguards developed over generations of criminal jurisprudence. The investigation into the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg illustrates how advances in forensic science and long-standing principles of due process must operate together. The pursuit of justice requires not only identifying the person responsible for a crime, but also ensuring that every stage of the investigation and trial satisfies the legal standards upon which public confidence in the criminal justice system depends. The investigation into the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg has become one of the most frequently cited examples in discussions about the evolution of modern cold case investigations. Although the case is often remembered because investigators successfully applied investigative genetic genealogy to generate a critical lead, its broader significance extends far beyond a single scientific technique. The investigation demonstrated how decades of careful evidence preservation, collaboration across multiple disciplines, and continued investment in forensic science can transform cases once considered unlikely to be solved. At the same time, subsequent judicial review highlighted the importance of ensuring that emerging investigative methods are integrated into the criminal justice system in a manner consistent with established legal principles. Together, these developments have influenced how law enforcement agencies, forensic laboratories, prosecutors, and policymakers approach unsolved homicide investigations. One of the most important lessons concerns evidence preservation. During the original investigation in 1987, detectives and forensic specialists collected and stored biological evidence according to accepted standards, despite the limited capabilities of contemporary DNA technology. At the time, no one could predict that scientific methods developed decades later would require precisely those preserved samples. The case therefore reinforced a principle already recognized within forensic science. Evidence should be preserved whenever reasonably possible because future technologies may reveal information unavailable at the time of collection. Many agencies subsequently reviewed their evidence retention policies, particularly for unsolved homicides, recognizing that properly maintained biological evidence represents a long-term investigative resource rather than merely historical documentation. The investigation also demonstrated the importance of maintaining comprehensive case documentation. Cold case inquiries often span multiple decades, during which investigators retire, agencies reorganize, and forensic techniques change substantially. Success depends upon the ability of new investigators to understand exactly what their predecessors observed, collected, tested, and concluded. In the Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation, detailed reports prepared by the original investigative team allowed later detectives to build upon existing work rather than beginning anew. This continuity illustrates why thorough documentation remains one of the most valuable components of any homicide investigation, regardless of whether immediate arrests occur. The emergence of investigative genetic genealogy represented another major influence on the broader field of criminal investigation. Before its development, many cold cases possessing usable DNA evidence remained unsolved simply because the unknown offender was absent from conventional law enforcement databases. Genetic genealogy introduced a fundamentally different investigative strategy by identifying biological relatives rather than seeking an exact database match. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation demonstrated that distant familial relationships, when combined with traditional genealogical research and conventional police investigation, could generate investigative leads unavailable through earlier methods. Importantly, the case also clarified the proper role of investigative genetic genealogy within criminal investigations. Law enforcement agencies increasingly recognized that genealogy should be viewed as a lead generation technique rather than as courtroom evidence establishing guilt. Detectives must still conduct independent investigation, corroborate genealogical findings through conventional methods, obtain legally admissible evidence, and satisfy all constitutional and procedural requirements governing criminal prosecutions. This distinction has become a central principle in modern forensic practice and is reflected in guidance developed by many agencies adopting investigative genetic genealogy. Following the widespread attention generated by several successful cold case investigations, including the Cook and Van Cuylenborg case, numerous law enforcement agencies established specialized cold case units or expanded existing programs dedicated to reviewing unsolved violent crimes. These units frequently combine experienced homicide investigators, forensic scientists, prosecutors, analysts, and, where appropriate, professional genealogists. Rather than relying upon periodic informal case reviews, agencies increasingly adopted structured approaches involving systematic evidence reassessment, forensic reexamination, and evaluation of cases potentially suitable for advanced DNA analysis or genealogical investigation. Forensic laboratories likewise experienced significant changes. As demand for advanced DNA testing increased, laboratories invested in improved analytical technologies, expanded quality assurance procedures, and developed specialized expertise concerning samples recovered from decades-old investigations. Scientific organizations also produced recommendations regarding laboratory validation, contamination prevention, documentation standards, and reporting practices applicable to forensic genealogy. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation became one of several practical examples demonstrating the importance of rigorous laboratory procedures throughout every stage of evidence analysis. The case also contributed to continuing discussions concerning ethics and privacy, because investigative genetic genealogy relies upon DNA voluntarily submitted by individuals interested in family history research. Questions naturally arose regarding informed consent, data access, transparency, and appropriate law enforcement use. In response, several genealogy companies revised their user policies, clarified whether law enforcement access would be permitted, and introduced mechanisms allowing users to make informed decisions regarding participation. Policymakers, legal scholars, and privacy advocates likewise examined the implications of forensic genealogy, seeking to balance the public interest in solving serious violent crimes with respect for individual privacy and civil liberties. Judicial review of the Cook and Van Cuylenborg case also influenced legal education and prosecutorial practice. The Washington Supreme Court's decision ordering a new trial demonstrated that even scientifically significant investigations must satisfy established evidentiary standards. Prosecutors increasingly recognize the importance of distinguishing between genealogy as an investigative technique and the independently obtained forensic evidence ultimately presented to juries. This distinction has informed trial preparation, expert witness testimony, and judicial consideration of emerging scientific methods in subsequent cases. Beyond the legal and scientific communities, the investigation affected public understanding of cold case investigations. Popular media frequently portrays unsolved crimes as investigations abandoned after early efforts fail. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg case demonstrated a different reality. Cold case investigations often continue through periodic review, evidence preservation, technological reassessment, and renewed scientific analysis extending across decades. Public appreciation for the complexity of these investigations has increased as more cases have been resolved through advances in forensic science combined with persistent investigative work. The investigation further highlighted the importance of interdisciplinary collaboration. Successful resolution required contributions from homicide detectives, forensic biologists, genealogists, laboratory quality assurance specialists, prosecutors, evidence custodians, and judicial authorities. No single discipline possessed all the necessary expertise. Instead, progress resulted from integrating specialized knowledge while maintaining clear communication and adherence to professional standards. This collaborative model has become increasingly common in complex cold case investigations worldwide. Educational institutions have also incorporated lessons from the investigation into training programs for criminal justice professionals. Police academies, forensic science courses, law schools, and continuing professional education programs frequently examine the case to illustrate principles of evidence preservation, chain of custody, DNA analysis, investigative planning, genealogical research, ethical decision-making, and courtroom presentation of scientific evidence. Students studying the case are encouraged to view it not merely as an example of technological success, but as a demonstration of how scientific innovation and traditional investigative practice must operate together. Perhaps the most enduring lesson emerging from the investigation is that scientific progress alone cannot solve cold cases. Advances in DNA technology, computational genealogy, and laboratory analysis became valuable only because earlier investigators preserved evidence carefully, documented their work comprehensively, and maintained confidence that future developments might one day reveal answers unavailable in 1987. Every stage of the investigation depended upon the work completed before it. The original detectives created the foundation. Subsequent investigators maintained it. Scientists expanded what the evidence could reveal. Prosecutors translated investigative findings into legal proceedings. Cortez evaluated those proceedings under established constitutional principles. The result is not simply the history of a single homicide investigation, but a comprehensive example of how modern criminal justice systems adapt to scientific innovation, while preserving the procedural safeguards essential to fairness. Today, the Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation continues to influence discussions surrounding forensic science, criminal investigation, legal procedure, and public policy. It remains a case studied not because it offers simple answers, but because it demonstrates the complexity of solving violent crimes across generations. The investigation reminds professionals throughout the criminal justice system that patience, rigorous scientific standards, interdisciplinary cooperation, and respect for legal process are all indispensable components of successful cold case investigations. Its legacy extends beyond the identification of a suspect, contributing to the continuing evolution of investigative practice in jurisdictions throughout North America and beyond. Every homicide investigation eventually becomes part of a larger historical record. Some cases are remembered because they established new legal precedents. Others are studied because they transformed investigative practice or accelerated scientific innovation. The investigation into the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg occupies a unique place within modern criminal justice because it accomplished all of these things to varying degrees. More than 3 decades separated the crimes from the identification of a suspect through investigative genetic genealogy, demonstrating both the extraordinary potential of forensic science and the enduring importance of meticulous investigative work. At the same time, the subsequent appellate proceedings reminded investigators and prosecutors that scientific innovation must always operate within the procedural safeguards that define a fair criminal justice system. The lasting legacy of the case therefore extends far beyond its individual facts, offering enduring lessons for detectives, forensic scientists, legal professionals, policymakers, and future generations of investigators. Perhaps the most important lesson concerns patience. Modern society often expects immediate answers, rapid arrests, and swift judicial outcomes. Cold case investigations rarely follow that pattern. They require persistence measured not in days or months, but in years, and sometimes decades. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation demonstrates that the absence of immediate success should not be mistaken for investigative failure. Detectives preserved evidence, documented every significant decision, maintained communication among agencies, and periodically revisited the case whenever scientific developments justified renewed examination. Their willingness to continue working in investigation long after public attention had faded ultimately created the opportunity for later breakthroughs. Evidence preservation forms another central legacy of the case. Biological samples collected in 1987 retained their investigative value because they were preserved according to accepted forensic standards. At the time of collection, investigators could not know precisely how future technologies would analyze the evidence. Nevertheless, by maintaining strict chain of custody procedures and protecting biological material from degradation or contamination, they ensured that future scientists would inherit evidence suitable for increasingly sophisticated laboratory examination. This lesson continues to influence evidence management policies in homicide investigations throughout many jurisdictions. The investigation also illustrates the cumulative nature of scientific progress. The case was not solved by a single invention or isolated discovery. Rather, it benefited from decades of incremental advances in molecular biology, DNA extraction techniques, genetic sequencing, computational analysis, forensic laboratory accreditation, genealogical research methods, and digital record management. Each scientific improvement expanded the information obtainable from preserved evidence. None of these developments alone solved the investigation. Together, however, they transformed evidence that once appeared insufficient into the foundation of renewed investigative activity. This cumulative process reflects the broader history of forensic science, in which major breakthroughs frequently result from the gradual refinement of multiple disciplines working together. Another enduring lesson involves interdisciplinary cooperation. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation required collaboration among homicide detectives, forensic biologists, evidence custodians, laboratory quality assurance specialists, genealogists, prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, and appellate courts. Every participant contributed expertise that complemented the work of others. Modern criminal investigations increasingly depend upon similar collaboration because complex cases often involve scientific, legal, technological, and investigative questions extending beyond the expertise of any single profession. The case, therefore, reinforces the value of communication, shared professional standards, and mutual respect among specialists working toward common investigative objectives. The judicial history of the investigation offers equally significant lessons. The Washington Supreme Court's decision to order a new trial demonstrated that courts remain responsible for ensuring that emerging investigative techniques are presented according to established evidentiary principles. Scientific innovation does not diminish constitutional protections or alter the burden of proof required in criminal proceedings. Instead, new investigative methods must be integrated into existing legal frameworks designed to protect fairness, transparency, and reliability. This aspect of the case has become especially important as courts continue evaluating novel forms of scientific evidence in criminal prosecutions. The investigation has also shaped discussions concerning investigative genetic genealogy itself. Following several successful applications in serious violent crime investigations, agencies throughout North America developed written policies governing when genealogy should be used, how genealogical information should be documented, and what legal approvals should precede its application. Professional organizations published best practice recommendations, emphasizing scientific validation, independent corroboration, transparency, and respect for applicable privacy protections. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation remains one of the practical examples frequently examined during these policy discussions because it illustrates both the promise and the responsibilities associated with advanced genetic investigation. Beyond the professional community, the case has influenced public understanding of cold case investigations. Popular portrayals sometimes suggest that unsolved crimes remain dormant until a dramatic breakthrough suddenly resolves every unanswered question. The historical record presents a more accurate picture. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation continued through repeated evidence reviews, advances in forensic science, careful laboratory work, and methodical detective investigation extending across generations of investigators. Scientific breakthroughs proved valuable precisely because earlier investigators had preserved the necessary evidence and documented their work with exceptional care. The case therefore reminds the public that successful cold case investigations usually result from sustained institutional commitment rather than isolated moments of discovery. For the families of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg, the investigation represents something more personal than a milestone in forensic history. Public statements made over the years consistently emphasize remembrance, gratitude toward investigators, and recognition of the enduring impact that violent crime has upon families and communities. While scientific advances understandably attract public attention, the central purpose of every homicide investigation remains constant: seeking truthful, evidence-based answers concerning the deaths of real individuals whose absence continues to affect those who knew them. Remembering the victims as people rather than simply as participants in a famous case remains an important aspect of the investigation's legacy. Educational institutions continue using the investigation as a teaching example across numerous disciplines. Police academies examine the case when discussing evidence preservation and cold case review. Forensic science programs analyze the laboratory developments that made renewed DNA testing possible. Law schools consider the evidentiary questions surrounding investigative genetic genealogy and appellate review. Ethics courses explore the balance between technological innovation and individual privacy. Historians of criminal justice study the investigation as an example of how scientific progress influences investigative practice over time. Few cases illustrate so many interconnected aspects of modern criminal investigation within a single historical narrative. Looking toward the future, the lessons emerging from the Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation remain highly relevant. Scientific capabilities will continue evolving. New laboratory methods, computational tools, digital technologies, and analytical techniques will undoubtedly expand what investigators can learn from preserved evidence. Yet the essential principles demonstrated by this case are unlikely to change. Evidence must be collected carefully, preserved responsibly, documented comprehensively, analyzed objectively, and presented fairly. Investigative curiosity must be balanced by scientific rigor. Technological innovation must operate within constitutional safeguards. Professional collaboration must remain grounded in transparency and accountability. These principles have guided effective criminal investigation for generations and will continue doing so, regardless of future technological change. Ultimately, the legacy of the Cook and Van Cuylenborg investigation is not defined solely by the identification of a suspect after more than 30 years. Its greater significance lies in demonstrating how disciplined police work, responsible evidence preservation, scientific advancement, interdisciplinary cooperation, and judicial oversight together create the possibility of resolving even the most challenging homicide investigations. The case reminds investigators that every carefully documented report, every properly preserved biological sample, every verified laboratory result, and every thoughtful, investigative decision may acquire new importance as science evolves. It also reminds society that justice is not measured by speed alone. In many cold cases, justice depends upon perseverance, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to follow reliable evidence wherever it ultimately leads. For these reasons, the investigation into the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg continues to stand as one of the defining case studies in the history of modern cold case investigation, offering lessons that will inform criminal justice practice for many years to come.